There is a city at the bottom of Mexico City. Not ruins exactly, not rubble. Something stranger than that. Foundations, streets, causeways. An entire civilization pressed into the earth beneath the concrete and exhaust and noise of 22 million people who walk above it every single day without knowing, or perhaps without wanting to know, what is under their feet. The Spanish called it the greatest city they had ever seen. Greater than Rome, greater than Constantinople, greater than anything the European mind had been trained to imagine. It sat in the middle of a lake. It was connected to the shore by long stone causeways, wide enough for 10 horses to walk side by side. It had aqueducts that carried fresh spring water from the mountains directly to public fountains in its streets. It had floating gardens that could grow maize and chilies and flowers in the middle of open water. It had a market so large and so organized that the Spanish soldiers who entered it for the first time simply stopped walking and stood there in silence, unable to speak. It had a population somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 people at a time, when London held perhaps 50,000, when Paris was still a cramped medieval tangle of streets, when most of Europe still considered a town of 10,000 to be impressively large. And then, in the space of roughly 2 years, it was gone, not abandoned, not slowly emptied as its people drifted away, gone in the way that only violence can make something gone. Pulled down stone by stone, its temples demolished, its causeways broken, its lake drained, its very name erased and replaced with another. And over the place where it had stood, a new city was built using the rubble of the old one, so thoroughly that for centuries, most of the world simply forgot it had existed at all. Tonight, we are going to go there. We are going to walk its streets before the end came. We are going to understand what was built, who built it, and why it lasted as long as it did. We are going to follow the story all the way to its ending, which was not quiet, which was not gentle, and which still echoes in ways that most history books are only beginning to honestly describe. This is the fall of Tenochtitlan, and it is one of the strangest, saddest, most complicated stories this world has ever produced. If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. There is something about history, told slowly, told carefully, told the way a long story deserves to be told, that settles the mind in a way that nothing else quite does. You do not have to follow every detail. You do not have to remember every name. Just let the story move through you the way water moves through a river channel, finding its own path, carrying you somewhere quieter than where you started. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you are right now and what time it is. The lake had no business supporting a city. That is the first thing to understand about Tenochtitlan. It was not built in a sensible place. It was not built on a river delta where food could be grown easily, or on a sheltered harbour where ships could dock safely, or on a high defensible hilltop where enemies could be spotted from miles away. It was built in the middle of Lake Texcoco, a broad, shallow, brackish lake sitting in a high mountain valley in central Mexico, ringed by volcanoes, prone to flooding, with no natural resources to speak of. The soil under the lake bed was soft and unstable. The water itself was not even fresh. It was partly salty, fed by mineral springs, not suitable for drinking or irrigation. And yet the people who built their city there turned all of those disadvantages into a kind of genius that still makes engineers and historians pause and reconsider what they thought they knew about pre-Columbian civilization. To understand why they built there at all, you have to go back to before the city existed, back to a group of people who, in the early part of the 12th century, had essentially nothing. No land of their own, no powerful allies, no great history to point to, no reputation that opened doors or bought goodwill. They were wanderers, migrants from the northwest, from a place they called Aztlan, though historians have spent considerable energy arguing about where exactly Aztlan was and have not reached a satisfying conclusion. The people themselves are what we now call the Mexica, though they would later be known by many other names. They spoke Nahuatl. They worshipped a sun god named Huitzilopochtli, who was in many ways a war god, a deity whose power was understood to be sustained by human sacrifice, by the offering of blood and hearts, by the energy released when a life was given to the sun, so that the sun would continue to rise. This theology would become one of the most misunderstood and sensationalized aspects of Mexica civilization, used for centuries as evidence that they were savage, that their destruction was deserved, that what happened to them was not really a tragedy, but a correction. We will return to that, but for now, what matters is this. They were wanderers, and they had been told by their priests and their god that they would know their home when they saw it. They would see an eagle perched on a cactus, holding a serpent in its beak, and that would be the sign, that would be the place. They wandered for nearly 2 centuries. Generations were born and died on the road. They moved through territory already claimed by other groups, sometimes welcomed, sometimes enslaved, sometimes driven out with violence. They were not powerful. They were not feared. They were, by most accounts of the period, considered something of a nuisance by the more established city-states of the region. The Valley of Mexico in this period was not empty. It was crowded with competing polities, each with their own history, their own alliances, their own armies. The Mexica were late arrivals with nothing to offer, and a tendency toward behavior that their neighbors found alarming. There are accounts from this period of the Mexica being driven out of the city of Chapultepec, of being captured and enslaved by the people of Culhuacan, of being given a piece of land so rocky and inhospitable that it was essentially a joke, a way of saying, go suffer somewhere out of our sight. But the Mexica were persistent in a way that is difficult to explain from the outside. They had a belief that was almost structural, built into the way they understood time and fate and identity, a belief that they were going somewhere, that the suffering was the road and not the destination. In the year 1325, which is the date most commonly given, though it may have been earlier, a group of Mexica priests and their followers made their way out onto one of the small, reed-covered islands near the western shore of Lake Texcoco, and there, according to tradition, they saw it, an eagle, a cactus, a serpent. Whether the vision was literal or symbolic, or a story that grew larger in the retelling over the following century, what is clear is that this was the moment the Mexica decided they had arrived. They began to build. The island was small, barely large enough to stand on, without your feet getting wet at the edges. But it had something the mainland did not. It had water around it on every side, water that could be crossed by controlled routes, by bridges and causeways that could be raised or broken in the event of attack, water that made approach difficult for enemies who did not have boats, water that, paradoxically, would become the foundation of the most sophisticated agricultural system in the pre-Columbian Americas. They called the island Tenochtitlan. The name is typically translated as place of the prickly pear cactus, or place where the cactus grows, in reference to the founding vision. And from that starting point, from that small wet island in a brackish lake that nobody else wanted, they began building something that would, within 200 years, be one of the largest and most complex urban centers on the surface of the earth. The first thing they built was a temple. Not houses, not walls, not storage facilities. A temple. This tells you something important about the way the Mexica understood their world. The sacred center came first. Everything else would grow outward from that point of connection between the human and the divine. The temple to Huitzilopochtli was small at first, a modest wooden structure on a modest platform, but it was placed at what the Mexica understood to be the exact center of the world, the navel of the universe, the axis around which everything else rotated. Over the following 2 centuries, that temple would be rebuilt and enlarged 7 times, each new construction wrapped around the previous one like the layers of an onion, so that by the time the Spanish arrived, the Great Temple, the Templo Mayor as it is now called, was a massive double pyramid, rising to perhaps 60 meters at its highest point, with staircases broad enough for processions and platforms at the top, where the most important rituals of Mexica religious life were performed. It was visible from miles away. It was the point from which the city was oriented. Everything in Tenochtitlan pointed back to it. The second problem they solved was the problem of the water itself. The island was surrounded by it, and that water needed to become useful rather than merely threatening. The Mexica developed a system of agriculture called chinampa farming. and it is one of the great engineering achievements of the pre-Columbian world. The idea was elegant in the way the best ideas always are. You take lake mud, which is extraordinarily rich in nutrients. You pile it onto a frame made of woven reeds and branches. You anchor that frame to the shallow lake bed with the roots of willow trees. You create, in effect, an artificial island. Then you create another one beside it, leaving a canal between them narrow enough to navigate by canoe, then another, until the shallow margins of the lake are a network of long, thin, raised garden beds separated by water channels, and those garden beds can grow crops year-round in one of the most productive agricultural systems ever devised. Yields on chinampas were extraordinary, multiple harvests per year, soil that never depleted because the lake water constantly refreshed it with new nutrients, and the canals themselves became transportation routes, so that food could be moved from the gardens to the city by canoe without ever touching a road. The chinampas did not just feed the city, they extended the city. As the population grew, more chinampas were built, and the city grew with them, its edges soft and green and smelling of rich earth and canal water, its center rising in stone and plaster, and the bright colors of painted temples. Water was everywhere in Tenochtitlan, but most of it was not drinkable. The lake water was brackish, with enough salt content to make it unfit for human consumption. This was a serious problem for a city of hundreds of thousands of people. The Mexica solved it in the way they solved most of their problems, with engineering that their neighbors had not attempted and that the Spanish, when they arrived, could barely believe was real. They built aqueducts, long double pipe systems constructed of stone and clay that ran from freshwater springs in the hills of Chapultepec on the western shore, across the lake and into the heart of the city. The double pipe design was not aesthetic, it was functional. While one pipe delivered fresh water to the city, the other could be cleaned and maintained, so the supply was never fully interrupted. Repair crews could work without shutting down the entire system. At the ends of the aqueducts, inside the city, the water flowed into public fountains and distribution points where it could be collected by residents and vendors who sold it by the jar in the market. Not everyone had running water in their home, but the city had clean water, reliably, in quantities that could support a population that most European cities of the period could not even imagine. And then there were the causeways. 3 main causeways connected the island city to the mainland, running north, south, and west. They were wide enough, as the Spanish would later note with astonishment, for 10 horsemen to ride abreast. They were raised above the water level of the lake, which meant that in times of flooding they remained passable when the surrounding landscape turned to marsh. They were punctuated by wooden drawbridges that could be raised to control movement, to cut off pursuit, to isolate sections of the approach route during military operations. The causeways were not just transportation infrastructure, they were military architecture. They were the gates of the city, and crossing one was an experience that impressed upon any visitor exactly what kind of place they were entering. The city that you would have found at the end of those causeways in, say, the year 1500, was a place of extraordinary complexity and sensory intensity. The streets were clean. This is one of the things the Spanish noted first and most consistently, the cleanliness. There were crews of workers, something like a municipal sanitation department, who swept the streets each morning, who collected waste and transported it by canoe to the chinampas, where it would be used as fertilizer, who kept the canals clear of debris. In a period when the streets of European cities were commonly used as open sewers, when the Thames smelled of the waste of London's population, when rats and cholera moved through medieval cities largely unchecked, Tenochtitlan had a system. It was not perfect, no city is, but it was deliberate, organized, maintained. The market at Tlatelolco deserves its own consideration, because the market is where you can most clearly see what the city actually was. Tlatelolco was technically a separate city from Tenochtitlan, built on an adjacent island, but by the time of the Spanish arrival, the two had merged into a single urban mass, and the great market of Tlatelolco was understood by everyone who saw it to be one of the wonders of the known world. The Spanish soldier, Bernal Diaz del Castillo, who walked through it with Hernán Cortés in 1519, wrote about it in his memoir decades later. and his description still carries the weight of genuine amazement from a man who had already seen a great deal of the world and thought himself unlikely to be surprised. He described the market as being so large and so full that from above, from the platform of a nearby temple, you could not see from one end to the other through the crowd. He described the order of it. Each type of goods in its own section, separated from others, so that the gold merchants were here, and the cloth merchants were there, and the slave traders were in another place entirely, and the food vendors were arranged by type, along their own rows. He described the court where disputes between merchants were settled, a kind of commercial judiciary that operated continuously throughout the market day. He described the volume of goods: cacao beans, which were used as currency, maize and beans and squash, tropical feathers from birds brought from the lowland jungles, obsidian blades so sharp that modern surgeons have experimented with them as alternatives to steel, scalpels, copper bells, rubber balls, pottery from dozens of different traditions, live animals, cooked food, medicine, lumber, paper made from fig bark, rope, sandals, clothing in a range of qualities and prices. He estimated 60,000 people in the market on the days he visited. Other sources suggest the number was higher on the major market days, which came every 5 days on the Mexica calendar. Whatever the true number, it was a scale of commercial activity that had no equivalent anywhere in the world that any of the Spanish soldiers had come from. The people who moved through that market, who lived in the houses along the clean canal streets, who paddled their canoes out to the chinampas each morning and brought back their harvest in the late afternoon, who climbed the steps of the Templo Mayor for the great festivals, were not a monolithic mass. Tenochtitlan was a cosmopolitan city by the standards of any era. It had a distinct social hierarchy. At the top were the Tlatoani, the ruler, and the noble families, the Pipiltin, whose children attended schools called Calmecac, where they learned history, astronomy, rhetoric, ritual, and the arts of war and governance. Below the nobility were the commoners, the Masawaltin, who were themselves divided into clans called Calpuli, each with its own neighborhood, its own patron deity, its own traditions, its own obligations to the city. The Calpuli system was something like a cross between an extended family network and a ward in a modern city, providing social support, land allocation, and communal identity to its members. Below the commoners were various categories of dependent workers and, at the bottom, slaves. Though Mexica slavery was a different institution from the chattel slavery that the Atlantic world would later develop, with more defined legal protections and clearer pathways to freedom. The city was also the capital of something much larger than itself. The Triple Alliance, which historians sometimes call the Aztec Empire, though the Mexica themselves would not have used that term, was a confederacy of 3 city-states: Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan. Together they dominated central Mexico and extended their influence across an enormous range of territory, from the Gulf Coast to the Pacific, from the northern deserts to the southern highlands of what is now Oaxaca. The word empire is in some ways accurate and in some ways misleading. The Triple Alliance did not typically govern its subject territories directly, installing its own administrators and remaking local institutions in its own image. It extracted tribute, enormous quantities of tribute, documented in detailed records called the Codex Mendoza, which lists the goods that flowed into Tenochtitlan from across its sphere of influence. Cotton cloth by the hundreds of bundles, cacao by the load, precious feathers, jade, gold dust, rubber, copal incense, warrior costumes, food. The tribute system created the wealth that made Tenochtitlan possible, that paid for the construction of its temples and its causeways and its public spaces, that stocked the market with the extraordinary variety of goods that so astonished the Spanish. It also created enemies. The territories that paid tribute did not do so willingly. They did so because the military power of the Triple Alliance made resistance too costly, and that meant that there were, scattered across the reach of the empire, communities that resented Tenochtitlan with a depth and a consistency that the Mexica ruling class seems to have understood but perhaps underestimated. One people in particular never submitted: the Tlaxcalans, whose city-state occupied a high mountain valley to the east of Tenochtitlan, had resisted absorption into the Triple Alliance for generations. The wars between Tenochtitlan and Tlaxcala were a persistent feature of the political landscape of central Mexico, and they were not simply wars of conquest. They had become something more ritualized, more complex. The Mexica called them flower wars, Xochiayotl, and they functioned at least in part as a mechanism for capturing prisoners who could be sacrificed to maintain the favor of the gods. Scholars debate whether the Flower War was primarily a religious institution or primarily a political and military tool for maintaining pressure on difficult neighbors. But what is certain is that the Tlaxcalans remained unconquered, remained autonomous, remained resentful of Tenochtitlan in a way that would become, when the moment came, one of the decisive factors in the city's destruction. But that moment had not yet come. In the year 1500, Tenochtitlan was at or near the height of its power. The Tlatoani was Ahuizotl, one of the most aggressive and expansionist rulers in the city's history, under whose leadership the empire had extended further than it ever had before. The temples were being rebuilt and enlarged, the tribute was flowing, the market was full, the population was growing, the chinampa fields were spreading, the aqueducts were running clean, and if there were tensions within the empire, if there were restless subject peoples and unconquered neighbors, and a ruling class grown perhaps a little too confident in the permanence of what they had built, these were the ordinary strains of any successful civilization. The things you managed and monitored and addressed but did not fear would bring the entire structure down, because what was coming was not ordinary. What was coming was not something that any previous political experience had prepared anyone in central Mexico to understand or resist. What was coming had never happened before in this part of the world, and would never happen again in quite the same way, and it began with ships. The ships arrived on the eastern coast of Mexico in 1517, and then again in 1518, reconnaissance expeditions sent from Cuba by the Spanish governor Diego Velázquez, who had heard rumors from trading networks that stretched further than anyone had mapped, rumors of rich lands to the west, of gold and stone cities, and organized peoples, unlike the island communities the Spanish had so far encountered in the Caribbean. The first two expeditions came back with enough information to confirm that something significant was out there, and with enough casualties to confirm that reaching it would not be simple. The third expedition, organized in late 1518 and launched in February 1519, was led by a man named Hernán Cortés. He was 33 years old. He was a lawyer by training who had never practiced law, a colonist from the Spanish province of Extremadura who had been in the Caribbean for 15 years without distinguishing himself in any particularly remarkable way, a man with debts and ambitions and an ability to inspire loyalty in other men that was, by all accounts, genuinely extraordinary. He also had the kind of recklessness that, in hindsight, gets called genius and in real time gets people killed. He departed Cuba without the full authorization of Governor Velázquez, who had second thoughts about Cortés at the last moment and tried to revoke his command. Cortés ignored the revocation and sailed anyway. He was, from the first moment of the expedition, operating outside the law, which meant that his only option was to succeed spectacularly enough that the law would retroactively bless what he had done. He had 11 ships. He had roughly 500 men, though the exact number varies by source. He had 16 horses, the first horses most of the people of Mexico had ever seen. He had a small number of artillery pieces, iron cannon that could fire iron and stone projectiles. He had mastiffs, large war dogs trained to attack on command. He had steel swords and armor, crossbows, and harquebuses, which were early firearms that were loud and smoky and slow to reload, but profoundly terrifying to people who had never heard the sound of a gun. And he had something that would prove more valuable than any weapon in his arsenal. A woman named Malintzin, known to history by the Spanish name Marina, or in later Mexican historical memory as La Malinche, who spoke both Nahuatl, the language of the Mexica, and Maya, which overlapped with the linguistic range of a Spanish priest named Jerónimo de Aguilar, who had been shipwrecked on the Yucatan coast years earlier and was already with the expedition. This two-step translation chain, from Nahuatl to Maya to Spanish and back again, was clumsy and imperfect, but it worked, and Malintzин's intelligence and political understanding of the world she navigated made her far more than a translator. She became Cortés's primary interpreter of the political landscape of central Mexico, his guide to the tensions and alliances and resentments that structured the world he was trying to enter, his advocate in conversations with peoples and rulers who had no framework for understanding what he was or what he wanted. Without her, the conquest as it happened would not have been possible. This is acknowledged more honestly now than it once was, though the complexity of her position, a woman of noble birth, who had been sold into slavery, and who navigated the catastrophic intersection of two worlds with intelligence and pragmatism, continues to be debated in ways that simple heroism or simple villainy cannot contain. The expedition moved up the Gulf Coast of Mexico through the spring of 1519, making contact with various coastal peoples, fighting some battles, establishing some alliances, and gathering information at every stop about what lay further inland. The information was consistent and extraordinary. There was a great city in the mountains, and it was ruled by a great lord named Moctezuma, which the Spanish heard and recorded as Moctezuma, and which was a title as much as a name, meaning something like "he who frowns like a lord" or "the wrathful lord," though both translations flatten the significance of a title that indicated a specific kind of authority. Moctezuma Xocoyotzin, to give him his full name, was the 9th Tlatoani of Tenochtitlan, and by 1519 he had been ruling for 17 years. He was not a weak ruler, he was not an indecisive one. He had expanded the empire further, fought successful wars, managed the tribute system with efficiency, maintained the great ritual calendar, overseen the rebuilding of the Templo Mayor, but he was facing something in 1519 for which nothing in his experience, or in anyone's experience in central Mexico, had prepared him. Reports began reaching Tenochtitlan in the late months of 1518 about strange beings on the coast. They came in floating mountains, in great houses that moved on the water. They had weapons that made the sound of thunder and produced fire and smoke. They rode on the backs of enormous deer, creatures that no one in central Mexico had ever seen. Some of them had hair on their faces, which was unusual. Some of them had skin that was described as the color of ash or lime. There were various interpretations of what they were, and one of the most enduring and controversial questions in the historiography of the conquest is the degree to which Moctezuma and his advisors believed that Cortés might be the god Quetzalcoatl returning from the east. The legend of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, the god of wind and learning and dawn, who had, according to myth, departed to the east promising to return, and who was associated in some traditions with a light skin and a beard, does appear to have been active in Mexica thought in this period. Some historians argue that this identification of Cortés with Quetzalcoatl was the central psychological factor that explained Moctezuma's response to the Spanish arrival, his apparent willingness to receive Cortés, his gifts of gold and featherwork and food that may have been read as diplomatic offerings but were interpreted by the Spanish as tribute, his eventual decision to allow Cortés and his men to enter Tenochtitlan itself. Other historians are deeply skeptical, pointing out that much of the evidence for this identification comes from sources written decades after the conquest and may reflect a retrospective explanation that served the purposes of both Spanish administrators seeking to justify the conquest and indigenous informants seeking to explain why things had gone so wrong so fast. The truth, as with most things about this period, is probably somewhere in the middle, uncertain and irreducible to a single clean story. What is clear is that Moctezuma's initial response to the Spanish presence was cautious, diplomatic, and strategically sensible given the information available to him. He sent ambassadors with gifts. The gifts were extraordinary: a headdress of quetzal feathers, discs of gold and silver as large as wagon wheels, elaborately worked turquoise masks, fine cotton cloth, obsidian mirrors. They were sent with specific instructions. Find out what these strangers are, what they want, whether they can be satisfied and sent away. The gifts had the opposite effect from what was intended. When Cortés laid them out on the deck of his ship and looked at them, what he saw was not a diplomatic offering. What he saw was evidence of exactly what he had hoped to find: wealth and more wealth, and a civilization capable of producing that kind of wealth in quantities sufficient to justify an enormous personal risk. The Spanish moved inland from the coast in August 1519. The path they took, through the lowland jungle and then up into the high mountain country, was grueling. The climate shifted dramatically with altitude, from the humid coastal lowlands to the cold, thin air of the mountain passes, where the volcanoes Popocatépetl and Iztaccíhuatl rose above everything in snow-capped silence. The march took months, and it was not uneventful. Near the city of Cholula, which was one of the great religious centers of central Mexico, there was an incident that the Spanish called a preemptive strike against a conspiracy, and that most modern historians view as a massacre, a sudden killing of unarmed Cholulan nobles and warriors in the main square of the city, an act of calculated terror that announced to the political world of central Mexico exactly what kind of force was now moving through it. The exact truth of what happened at Cholula is still debated. What is certain is that hundreds or perhaps thousands of people were killed in a very short time, and that the news of it traveled fast, and that the towns and cities between Cholula and Tenochtitlan, when the Spanish arrived at their gates, did not resist. But before Cholula, there was Tlaxcala. The Spanish reached Tlaxcala in September 1519, and the Tlaxcalans attacked them several times. The battles were serious. The Spanish lost men, horses were killed, Cortés was wounded, but the Spanish weapons, the steel and the horses and the guns, gave them an edge that the Tlaxcalans could not overcome through numbers alone, and after several weeks of fighting, the Tlaxcalan leadership made a decision that would alter the history of the continent. They offered peace. More than peace, they offered alliance. The Tlaxcalans had spent generations resisting the Mexica, and here was a force that had just demonstrated that it could fight the Mexica's way and win. Whatever Cortés was, whatever he wanted, the Tlaxcalans calculated that the enemy of their enemy was worth betting on. They provided Cortés with food, with information, with lodging, and ultimately with soldiers. Thousands of Tlaxcalan warriors would march with the Spanish on the final assault on Tenochtitlan. The Tlaxcalan alliance was not a footnote to the conquest. It was one of its central mechanisms. The fall of Tenochtitlan was not a story of Spanish weapons defeating indigenous resistance. It was a story of indigenous civil war, of empire collapse partly from within, accelerated and directed by a small group of Spanish soldiers who arrived at exactly the right moment to turn existing tensions into catastrophic rupture. The Spanish and their Tlaxcalan allies reached the Valley of Mexico in early November 1519. From the pass between the great volcanoes, they would have been able to see the whole layout of the world they were entering. The lake, sprawling and silver in the morning light, the causeway cities arranged around its shores, and at the center, connected to everything, rising above the water in its pyramid temples and its painted walls, Tenochtitlan. Bernal Diaz wrote later that some of his companions asked whether they were dreaming. This is perhaps the kind of retrospective eloquence that memoirs attract when they are written decades after the fact, but it contains something real. The experience of coming over a mountain pass and seeing for the first time a city of a scale and complexity that contradicted everything your previous experience of the world had taught you to expect. Moctezuma sent another delegation to meet the Spanish as they came down from the pass. More gifts, more information gathering, more diplomacy of the kind that assumed the usual rules applied, that generosity and ceremony and the proper management of powerful visitors would eventually resolve whatever situation this was. He was working with tools that had served the Triple Alliance well for generations, the tools of a sophisticated political culture that knew how to manage relationships between unequal powers, how to absorb new elements into existing hierarchies, how to make guests into clients, and clients into tributaries. None of those tools were designed for what Cortés was. On the 8th of November, 1519, Hernán Cortés and his army, accompanied by thousands of Tlaxcalan and other allied warriors, walked the southern causeway into Tenochtitlan. Moctezuma came out to meet them at the entrance to the city. This meeting, which almost every account of the conquest describes in elaborate and often contradictory detail, has become one of the most iconic moments in the history of the Americas. The elaborate protocol of the greeting, Moctezuma carried on a litter by his nobles, descending to walk the last stretch on foot, approaching Cortés, offering a gift of flowers and jade and gold. Cortés dismounting and attempting to embrace the Tlatoani, which was a gesture so far outside the protocol of Mexica court behavior that it had to be physically prevented by Moctezuma's attendants. The exchange of pleasantries through the translation chain, the beginning of what both sides seemed to have understood as a relationship whose terms were not yet fixed. They entered the city together. The Spanish were given quarters in the palace of Moctezuma's father, Axayacatl, which was a grand complex near the Templo Mayor, with enough rooms to house the entire Spanish force and their Tlaxcalan allies. They were fed. They were given tours. Moctezuma took Cortés personally to the top of the Templo Mayor and showed him the city from the summit, laid out below them in its canals and causeways, and market plazas and bright-coloured temples. Cortés looked at it and thought about how to take it. Moctezuma looked at his city and thought about what it meant that this strange visitor was standing beside him at the top of the pyramid that was the centre of the world. Neither of them, at that moment, could have fully understood what was beginning. The Spanish stayed. Days passed, then weeks. The relationship between the guests and their host grew more complex, more tense, more strange. Cortés and his men were free to move through the city, and they moved through it with their eyes open, noting the layout of the streets, the position of the causeways, the depth of the water around the city, the location of the armories and the food stores. They were gathering intelligence in the most literal sense. And then, about a week into their stay, Cortés made a move that transformed everything. On the pretext of a Spanish soldier killed on the coast, an incident whose details are disputed, Cortés went to Moctezuma's apartments with a small armed escort and told the Tlatoani that he must come with the Spanish, voluntarily, to the palace where the Spanish were staying and remain there as their guest. This was not a request. It was, dressed in the most elaborate diplomatic language Malintzin could manufacture, a threat backed by the presence of armed men with steel weapons in the room. Moctezuma went, whether from shock, from diplomatic calculation, from a genuine belief that compliance was the wisest path, from some combination of all of these, the ruler of one of the greatest cities on earth allowed himself to be walked through his own streets to a form of captivity in a foreign soldier's quarters. The Mexican nobles and warriors around the city watched this happen and did not intervene, and their failure to intervene in that moment has been debated and analysed for centuries. In the months that followed, a strange suspended reality settled over Tenochtitlan, a city whose ruler was technically present and technically governing, but who was functionally a prisoner, speaking to his nobles through an intermediary, ordering the continuation of tribute payments to Tenochtitlan, but also ordering the cessation of those things, like human sacrifice and the display of the gods, that the Spanish found most objectionable. The tension in the city was palpable. The population watched the Spanish soldiers with a hostility that was barely contained. The nobles met and argued and planned. And then a crisis arrived from outside. A new Spanish force had landed on the coast. The governor of Cuba, Velázquez, furious at Cortés's unauthorized departure, had sent an expedition under a commander named Panfilo de Narvaez to arrest Cortés and bring him back to face charges. This force was larger than Cortés's own, with more men and more weapons. Cortés made a decision that was either brilliantly audacious or suicidally reckless, depending on how you look at it. He left Tenochtitlan, taking most of his force with him, to confront Narvaez on the coast. He left behind a garrison under the command of Pedro de Alvarado, a soldier known for his physical courage and his spectacular lack of political judgment. Cortés was gone for roughly 2 months. During those 2 months, something happened in Tenochtitlan that ended the strange suspended peace of the occupation and set the city on an irreversible course toward war. The festival of Toxcatl was one of the most important in the Mexica ritual calendar. It honored Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror, the dark and complex god of night and sorcery and destiny, whose relationship with Quetzalcoatl was one of the great mythological antagonisms at the heart of Mexica cosmology. The festival involved dancing and singing and elaborate processions, and the central ceremony featured the sacrifice of a young man who had spent the previous year living as the embodiment of the god, treated with extraordinary honor and reverence before the moment of his death. Thousands of Mexica gathered in the great courtyard of the Templo Mayor for the festival of Tenochtitlan in May of 1520. They were unarmed. This was a religious ceremony, not a military assembly, and the protocol of the festival was clear on this point. Participants came to dance and to witness, not to fight. Pedro de Alvarado ordered his men to seal the entrances to the courtyard. Then he ordered them to attack. The reasons Alvarado gave afterward, in the accounts written to explain and justify the massacre, were that he had received intelligence of a plot, that the gathering was a cover for an uprising being planned against the Spanish garrison. Some historians give this some credence. Others find the evidence for a plot entirely unconvincing. What is beyond dispute is what happened next. The Spanish soldiers entered the courtyard with their weapons drawn and killed the people inside it. Many of the dead were musicians, the drummers and flute players who led the festival procession. Many were the sons of noble families, the young men who had the right and the social obligation to participate in the most important religious ceremonies of the year. The death toll was in the hundreds, possibly in the low thousands. The bodies lay in the courtyard, the drums went silent. And then the city of Tenochtitlan, which had been watching the Spanish with barely contained fury for months, erupted. The Mexica warriors attacked the Spanish garrison. The Spanish, suddenly besieged, sent urgent messages to Cortés on the coast. Moctezuma, still technically in Spanish custody, was brought forward to speak to his people from a rooftop and ask them to stop fighting. The accounts of what happened vary dramatically. The Spanish accounts say he was pelted with stones and wounded by his own people, who had lost patience with a ruler they now saw as compromised, a tool of the invaders. Mexica, accounts preserved in later codices, suggest that what happened was more complicated, that Moctezuma's position was viewed not simply as weakness, but as a betrayal so profound that the categories of loyalty and identity had to be renegotiated in the aftermath. What is agreed on is that Moctezuma died shortly after this episode. The Spanish said his people killed him with thrown stones. Mexica accounts suggested the Spanish killed him when he was no longer useful. The truth has not been resolved in 500 years, but the effect was the same. The ruler was gone, the city was in open revolt, and the Spanish garrison was trapped in the palace of Axayacatl, with Mexica warriors surrounding them on every side. Cortés returned from the coast having defeated Narvaez, absorbed most of his troops, and increased his force significantly. He arrived at Tenochtitlan to find the city in open war. He tried diplomacy. He tried to speak with the new Tlatoani, Cuitlahuac, a brother of Moctezuma who had been elected by the nobles in the crisis. Cuitlahuac was not interested in diplomacy. He was a military commander who understood exactly what the situation required. The Spanish were surrounded. Their causeway exits could be controlled. Their supply line was cut. They had food for perhaps a week. The Mexica warriors, fighting in familiar territory, with the support of the entire population of the city, with the ability to supply themselves continuously from the chinampas and the tribute networks, were in a fundamentally stronger position. All they needed to do was maintain the siege, and the Spanish would be destroyed. Cortés understood this. And so, on the night of the 30th of June, 1520, he attempted to escape. The night of the 30th of June and the 1st of July, 1520, is called in Spanish historical tradition La Noche Triste, the Night of Tears. It was an attempt by the entire Spanish force to leave Tenochtitlan in darkness, moving across the western causeway carrying as much gold and as many weapons as they could manage, hoping to be out of the city and onto the mainland before the alarm was raised. They built a portable bridge to cross the gaps in the causeway where the drawbridges had been raised. They gathered their Tlaxcalan allies. They began to move in the deep hours of the night, when the city was supposed to be sleeping. The city was not sleeping. A woman going to the canal to draw water saw them moving. She cried out. The alarm spread with the speed that only a city of hundreds of thousands can propagate sound and warning. Within minutes, the war canoes were on the water, approaching the causeway from both sides. Mexica warriors attacked from the front and from the flanks, shooting arrows and hurling stones and javelins from the canoes, while the Spanish struggled forward in their armor in the dark. The portable bridge jammed and could not be moved from the first gap in the causeway, so the Spanish had to cross the remaining gaps without it. Plunging into the water in their heavy armor, drowning, being pulled under by the weight of the gold, they refused to abandon. The gold. This is one of the details that stays with you. Men dying because they would not let go of gold. The horses panicked in the water and the narrow causeway. Men fell on top of men. The bodies of the dead and the dying piled up in the causeway gaps and became the bridge for those who came after. Cortés, who made it across, reportedly sat under a great tree called the Tree of the Sad Night, still standing in the Tacuba neighborhood of Mexico City, and wept. His biographers debated later whether the tears were grief or exhaustion or self-pity or some genuine human response to the scale of what had just happened. The Spanish lost roughly a third of their total force on the Noche Triste, including most of the gold they had accumulated. They lost cannon and crossbows and horses. They lost Tlaxcalan allies by the hundreds. They retreated eastward, back toward Tlaxcala, fighting a running battle the whole way. And at a place called Otumba, they met a Mexica army that had followed them from the city, a massive force that surrounded them on the plain and came close to finishing what the Night of Tears had started. The Spanish fought their way out of the battle at Otumba through a combination of desperate courage and the shock value of the cavalry, which could still break infantry formations even when the infantry vastly outnumbered the horses. They reached Tlaxcala, battered and diminished, and they stayed there, and they recovered, and they planned. What is astonishing, from the perspective of the months that followed, is that they did not give up. Cortés was not a man who processed defeat as defeat. He processed it as an obstacle between where he was and where he was going. He sent to Cuba and the Caribbean for more men, more weapons, more horses. He spent months in Tlaxcala, resting his force, treating the wounded, gathering intelligence, rebuilding relationships with his allies. He ordered the construction of something that had never been attempted in this part of the world. 13 brigantines, small sailing ships that could be transported overland in pieces and assembled on the shores of Lake Texcoco. If the lake was Tenochtitlan's protection, then the lake could also be Tenochtitlan's trap. Cortés intended to control the water. Meanwhile, in Tenochtitlan, something was happening that the Spanish did not cause and could not have predicted, but that would prove as destructive as anything they could have brought to the gates of the city. In September of 1520, the new Tlatoani Cuitlahuac died. He had been in power for 80 days. He died of smallpox. The disease had come with the Spanish, or rather had come with the African slave of one of Narvaez's men, a man named Francisco de Eguia, who had the disease when he arrived on the coast, and who died of it, but not before infecting others. And those others infected others, and the infection moved with the speed and indifference of a thing that has never encountered a population with any immunity at all. The Mexica, like all the indigenous peoples of the Americas, had no prior exposure to smallpox, no immunity, no resistance. The disease moved through Tenochtitlan with a speed and a mortality rate that we have no adequate description for, because the accounts that survive were written by people who were either themselves infected and barely alive, or by Spanish observers who did not understand what they were seeing and described it in terms of divine punishment. The population of the city and of the entire Valley of Mexico was devastated. Entire families were wiped out. The noble class, concentrated in the center of the city where the disease first spread, was particularly hard hit. The priests and astronomers and scribes who maintained the calendrical and ritual knowledge of the civilization died alongside the warriors and the farmers. The infrastructure of knowledge that made the city what it was, that maintained the traditions and the systems and the understanding of how everything worked, began to fracture. Cuitlahuac's successor was a young man named Cuauhtémoc. He was in his mid-20s, possibly younger. He was the son of a previous Tlatoani and related by blood to both Moctezuma and Cuitlahuac. He was, by the accounts of the period, including Spanish accounts, that had no reason to flatter him, an extraordinary individual, courageous, politically shrewd, committed to the defense of the city with a clarity of purpose that his predecessors had not been able to maintain in the face of the unprecedented pressure of the Spanish presence. He knew what was coming. He had watched the Noche Triste and the retreat to Tlaxcala, and he understood that the Spanish would return, better armed and with more allies. He set about preparing the city for a siege. He sent embassies to the surrounding city-states, to cities that had been tributaries and to cities that had been enemies, trying to build a coalition that could face the Spanish force. He had some success, but not enough. Too many communities had already calculated that the Spanish were going to win, and that the consequences of being on the wrong side of that outcome were too severe to risk. The empire that Tenochtitlan had built on the extraction of tribute and the threat of military force had not generated the kind of loyalty that holds in a crisis. When the crisis came, the calculation of many of Tenochtitlan's former tributaries was simple: better to be on the side that wins. Cuauhtémoc strengthened the city's defences. He removed the bridges from the causeways and dug trenches across them. He accumulated food stores. He organised the warrior corps and assigned defensive positions. He ordered the construction of new weapons, longer obsidian blades to counter the reach of Spanish swords, barricades that would channel attackers into killing zones, stake traps in the water to damage the brigantines Cortés was building. He was preparing, with intelligence and determination, for a fight he almost certainly knew he was going to lose. The imbalance was simply too great. Not in courage or commitment, not in the willingness to die for the city, but in the fundamental military and epidemiological calculus of the confrontation. The Spanish had steel and horses and guns. They had Tlaxcalan and Texcocan and dozens of other indigenous allies who provided them with tens of thousands of warriors who knew the terrain, who spoke the language, who had their own reasons for wanting Tenochtitlan broken. And they had smallpox, which did not stop when Cuitlahuac died, but continued moving through the population of the valley, killing without discrimination, weakening the capacity of the city to defend itself not through any deliberate act, but through the invisible mechanism of a pathogen encountering a virgin population. Cuauhtémoc could train warriors and fortify causeways and organize food supplies. He could not train his people's immune systems in the time available. Cortés returned to the Valley of Mexico in late December of 1520 and early January of 1521 with a vastly strengthened force. He had more men, he had more horses, he had more weapons and supplies. He had his 13 brigantines transported overland from the coast in pieces and ready to be assembled. He had an alliance that encompassed not just Tlaxcala, but also Texcoco, which had broken from the Triple Alliance and offered Cortés its lakeshore as a base of operations, and dozens of smaller communities that had signed on for various reasons. Old grievances against Tenochtitlan, calculated self-interest, straightforward coercion. The total force that Cortés could now field, counting all allied indigenous warriors, numbered perhaps 100,000 or more. Against the warriors of Tenochtitlan, themselves reduced by disease and siege and the loss of external tribute, the numerical imbalance was stark. The siege began in earnest in May of 1521 with the launching of the brigantines on the lake. This was the moment that Tenochtitlan's lake-bound position, which had been its greatest protection for 2 centuries, became its greatest vulnerability. The brigantines could attack the canoe fleets, could patrol the lake to intercept supply canoes, could support the causeway assaults from the water. The Mexico war canoes, which were fast and maneuverable, but powered by paddles against a wind-driven sail, could not outrun the brigantines or match their firepower. The lake was lost within the first days of fighting. Once the lake was lost, the causeways became the battlefield, and the battle on the causeways was the most brutal, sustained urban combat that this part of the world had ever seen. The siege lasted 75 days, 75 days of the kind of fighting that leaves nothing intact, neither stone nor spirit, neither the city itself nor the people inside it, nor, in a deeper sense, the people outside it who conducted the assault. The Spanish strategy was straightforward in concept and devastating in execution. Advance along the three causeways simultaneously, pushing into the city from north, south, and west, while the brigantines controlled the water and prevented resupply or escape. As the attackers advanced, they filled in the canals behind them, destroying the water channels that would otherwise allow the Mexica to move troops rapidly across the city and outflank the advancing columns. The canals that had been the nervous system of the city, carrying food and people and goods in every direction, became obstacles to be sealed. Every canal filled was another capillary of the city's circulation cut off, another degree of isolation imposed on the defenders. The Mexica fought. This cannot be stated too briefly or too simply. They fought with extraordinary effectiveness, using the urban terrain with the sophistication of warriors who knew every alley and courtyard and rooftop. The Spanish columns advanced and were repulsed, advanced and were repulsed, advanced and were sometimes nearly destroyed. On one occasion, in June, a Mexica counterattack captured 62 Spanish soldiers and several horses. The captured soldiers were taken to the Templo Mayor, which was still standing in the central district of the city, and sacrificed there in full view of the other Spanish soldiers watching from the causeway. Cortés, who had been wounded in the fighting, watched from a distance as his men were killed one by one at the top of the pyramid. The Spanish accounts of this moment describe it in terms of horror and religious outrage, and those feelings were real, but there is also something worth sitting with in the inverse of that image. The Mexica watching from the city as their own people were killed, day after day, in numbers far exceeding 62, by men who recorded the Spanish deaths with shock and the indigenous deaths with arithmetic. The fighting inside the city as the siege progressed was not just between warriors on both sides. The entire population of Tenochtitlan was trapped inside the shrinking perimeter. As the Spanish and their allies advanced and filled the canals and demolished the buildings ahead of them to clear lines of sight and movement, the civilians, the non-combatants, the old people and the children and the women, and the people who were too sick with smallpox or dysentery or simply starvation to stand, were pushed back toward the center of the city, then further back, then further still, into an ever smaller area where the density of suffering became something that even the most hardened of the Spanish soldiers found difficult to describe without the language breaking. Food ran out. Fresh water ran out because the aqueducts had been cut early in the siege. People drank canal water, which was now fouled with the bodies of the dead and the waste of tens of thousands of people confined in a shrinking space. Dysentery spread through the population, already weakened by smallpox. People died of thirst and starvation inside a city surrounded by a lake. The bodies accumulated faster than they could be moved. The city began to smell of death in a way that permeated everything. Cuauhtémoc did not surrender. This is worth understanding. He was offered terms, multiple times, by Cortés, who sent messengers through the ruins of the city, offering to negotiate an end to the fighting that would preserve the lives of the remaining population. Cuauhtémoc refused. He may have calculated that Spanish promises could not be trusted. He may have calculated that surrender meant enslavement and cultural annihilation, that the destruction of the civilization would proceed whether the fighting stopped or not. He may have understood, in some fundamental way, that what was being lost was not recoverable through negotiation, that there was no agreement that Cortés could offer that would give back what had already been taken. He may simply have been a man of extraordinary personal courage who found surrender unthinkable. Whatever the reason, he refused. And so the fighting continued until there was almost nowhere left to fight. By early August of 1521, the besieged population of Tenochtitlan was concentrated in the northeastern corner of the city, in the neighborhood of Tlatelolco, the old market city, which was the last district still in Mexica hands. The market that had astonished the Spanish 2 years earlier was now a refugee camp for thousands of starving, sick and dying people. Cuauhtémoc attempted one final breakout, trying to escape by canoe across the lake with a group of nobles and warriors. He was intercepted by a brigantine. The captain of the brigantine, a man named Garcia Holguin, recognized the royal canoe by its distinctive canopy and its occupants and cut it off. Cuauhtémoc was brought aboard. He asked to be killed rather than captured. Holguin refused. Cortés was brought the news and had the Tlatoani brought before him. The scene that the Spanish accounts describe is one of dignity on Cuauhtémoc's side, and something that Cortés, to his partial credit, at least recorded as dignity. The young ruler looked at Cortés and touched the dagger at Cortés's belt and said, in Malintzon's translation, that he had done everything he could to defend his city, and if he had failed, Cortés should use that dagger to kill him. Cortés did not kill him. He kept him alive, initially, because Cuauhtémoc was potentially useful, because the gold of Tenochtitlan that had been lost on the Noche Triste was still unaccounted for, and because the legitimacy that came from possessing the last ruler was politically valuable. The fall of Tenochtitlan is conventionally dated to the 13th of August 1521. That was the day Cuauhtémoc was captured and organized resistance ended, but the city had already been falling for much longer than that. The fall was a process, not an event. It happened in the massacre at Tenochtitlan and the Noche Triste, and the months of siege, and the cutting of the aqueducts, and the filling of the canals, and the steady bombardment of the causeways, and the disease that moved silently through the trapped population while the fighting took the lives that the disease had not yet reached. By the end, what remained inside the perimeter was barely recognizable as the place that had astonished the Spanish 2 years earlier. The temples were broken, the palaces were ruined, the market was silent, the causeways were choked with debris and bodies. The lake water, once clean enough to support the massive urban population that drank from its edges through carefully maintained aqueducts, was thick with the consequences of siege. The Spanish soldiers who entered the city after the fighting stopped had to cover their faces against the smell. The survivors, those who came out of the ruins, numbered in the tens of thousands at most, from a city that had held perhaps 250,000 people 2 years earlier. Many had died in the siege. Many had fled the city earlier, during the months of fighting, escaping across the lake or through the mountains. Many had died of smallpox before the siege even began. The proportional collapse of the population was of a scale that is difficult to hold in the mind steadily without flinching. This was not defeat in the ordinary sense. This was the near-total destruction of a civilization's human substrate, the people who carried the knowledge, and the tradition, and the language, and the memory. Cortés wrote to the Spanish king, Carlos I, about the conquest of Tenochtitlan in letters that are extraordinary documents, both for what they describe and for what they omit. He described the beauty of the city as it had been. He described the military operations in the kind of detail that a commander provides to justify his decisions. He described the submission of Cuauhtémoc. He described, in terms that are careful and strategic, the potential wealth of the territory he had conquered, the tribute that had been paid to the Triple Alliance and could now be paid to the Spanish crown, the gold and silver and cacao and cotton that flowed from across the empire to the center. He did not describe, except in passing, the scale of the human destruction. He did not describe the smell of Tenochtitlan in the last days of the siege. He did not describe what it meant for the people who had lived there to see their city demolished. The letters are the work of a man constructing his own legend while the dust was still settling. The process of erasure that followed the fall was both deliberate and organic, both the result of specific policies and the consequence of a more diffuse cultural logic that understood the existence of the old city as a problem to be solved. The Spanish, almost immediately, began using the rubble of Tenochtitlan as building material. The stones of the temples were pulled down and used to build a new cathedral on the site of the old sacred precinct. The stones of the palaces were used to build new administrative buildings. The image was deliberate. The Christian God literally built on top of the old gods. Christian authority literally constructed from the demolished substance of indigenous power. The main square of Mexico City, the Zócalo, sits where the heart of Tenochtitlan was, and the Metropolitan Cathedral of Mexico City sits partly on the foundations of the Templo Mayor, which you can see in the ruins excavated beside it. The old stones exposed and labelled and visited by tourists, who almost all arrive having walked past the Zocalo without realizing that they were walking on the city. The lake was drained over the following centuries, a process of gradual engineering that removed the water from the valley and replaced it with dry land. This was done partly because the lake flooded the new colonial city regularly, the same flooding that the Mexica had managed through their causeway and Chinampa system, and partly because the colonial administration's logic of space was fundamentally different from the indigenous logic of space, where the Mexica had built on and with the water. The Spanish wanted to build on solid ground. The draining of the lake eliminated the last physical traces of the context within which Tenochtitlan had made sense. Without the lake, the causeways that had connected the island city to the shore became, when their traces were eventually found, incomprehensible. What was this road doing in the middle of an urban neighborhood? It took centuries of archaeology to recover the understanding of the geography. The codices, the books of the Mexica, were targeted systematically. The Bishop of Mexico, Juan de Zumarraga, organized the burning of indigenous manuscripts in the early colonial period, destroying an unknown but certainly enormous quantity of historical, astronomical, religious, and calendrical knowledge accumulated over generations. The exact scale of the destruction is impossible to calculate, because we cannot know what we do not have, but scholars estimate that the surviving corpus of pre-Columbian Central Mexican manuscripts, perhaps a dozen or 20 major texts, represents a fraction of what once existed. The knowledge carried in those texts, the astronomical calculations, the historical records, the ritual calendars, the geographical surveys, the botanical knowledge, the medicinal traditions, did not simply disappear. Some of it was absorbed into the oral tradition of the surviving communities. Some of it was preserved by indigenous scholars working with Spanish missionaries to create new documents in Nahuatl using the Latin alphabet that captured at least some of what they could remember. Some of it was lost as completely as if it had never existed. The Nahuatl language was not destroyed, and this is one of the most important facts in the aftermath of the conquest. It survived. It was suppressed, reduced in status, pushed out of official and religious contexts, but it was spoken by millions of people across the colonial period and into the present. Today, Nahuatl is spoken by over 1.5 million people in Mexico, making it the most widely spoken indigenous language in the country. Many of the everyday words that have entered English from Spanish came originally from Nahuatl. Chocolate, tomato, avocado, chili, coyote, chocolate, guacamole. The language carried the civilization into the future in ways that the physical city could not. The story of what happened to Cuauhtémoc is one of the darkest postscripts to the fall of Tenochtitlan. Cortés kept him alive for several years, using him as a political symbol and occasionally as a hostage against indigenous unrest. In 1525, Cortés undertook an expedition to Honduras, taking Cuauhtémoc with him. On the road through the jungle, Cortés received a report, which some historians believe was fabricated or wildly exaggerated, that Cuauhtémoc was plotting a rebellion. Cortés ordered his execution. The last Tlatoani of Tenochtitlan was hanged from a tree in the jungle of what is now Belize, thousands of miles from the city he had defended to its last day. His body was left in the jungle. His resting place has never been found, though communities in the Mexican state of Guerrero have claimed for generations that his remains are buried among them, and the Mexican government has at various points undertaken investigations that have not reached definitive conclusions. Cuauhtémoc was declared a national hero of Mexico in the 19th century as part of the ideological work of building a post-colonial national identity that could distinguish itself from Spain. Statues of him stand in major plazas. His name is given to neighborhoods and metro stations and schools. He exists in Mexican public memory as a figure of indigenous dignity and resistance, and there is something genuinely moving about that, a culture recovering and claiming its own history, insisting that the people who defended Tenochtitlan deserve to be remembered. But there is also something complicated about the way national mythology works, the way it simplifies and solidifies what was actually a landscape of extraordinary moral complexity, a world in which the allied Tlaxcalans and Texcocans and dozens of other indigenous peoples who fought alongside the Spanish do not fit comfortably into any clean narrative of resistance versus conquest, a world in which the Spanish soldiers themselves were not a monolithic force, but a collection of individuals with varying degrees of awareness of what they were doing and varying degrees of doubt about whether it was right. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, who had been one of the soldiers who walked into the market at Tlatelolco and could not believe what he saw, who had crossed the causeways and fought in the streets and survived the Noche Triste and watched his companions sacrificed on the Templo Mayor, wrote his memoir decades later, in his old age in Guatemala, at a time when he felt that the conquest was being misrepresented in histories that gave too much credit to Cortés and not enough to the ordinary soldiers who had done the actual work. His book, The True History of the Conquest of New Spain, is one of the most extraordinary documents in the literature of the conquest, not because it is accurate in every particular, because it is not, but because it is written by a man who was actually there, who smelled the city and fought in its streets and watched it fall, and who in his old age, writing about events half a century in the past, kept circling back to the beauty of what he had seen and helped to destroy. He wrote about the city as it was in 1519, with a longing that is almost unbearable to read if you know what came after. He wrote that it was like a dream, and that all things pass away, and that there is nothing of it left. He wrote that he had written it down because he wanted someone to remember that it had existed. Someone should remember that it had existed. That is perhaps the simplest and most important thing to carry away from this story. The fall of Tenochtitlan was not simply the defeat of one army by another, it was the destruction of a civilization that had produced one of the greatest cities the world has ever seen. A civilization that had solved problems of urban engineering and agriculture and social organization in ways that the European tradition had not independently developed. A civilization whose cosmology and aesthetic and understanding of time and obligation were not primitive approximations of something European observers would later recognize as sophisticated but were fully realized systems in their own right, different from European systems, in ways that made them legible only if you were willing to take them seriously on their own terms. We are still not very good at that. The categories we use to think about the pre-Columbian Americas are still, largely, categories derived from the European tradition that encountered them and destroyed them and then, centuries later, began trying to understand what had been lost. The archaeology of Tenochtitlan, which has accelerated dramatically since the accidental discovery of the Coyolxauhqui stone in 1978 during utility work in downtown Mexico City, which prompted the excavation of the Templo Mayor site, is filling in details year by year. Each season of excavation produces new understanding, a new offering cache, a new inscription, a new architectural element that shifts the picture slightly or sometimes dramatically. The city that was supposed to have been completely buried and forgotten keeps insisting on its presence, keeps pushing artifacts up through the soil into the light of a city that was built on top of it. The soft ground of Mexico City, the ground that was once the bottom of Lake Texcoco, is still settling unevenly, and the buildings above it, including the Metropolitan Cathedral, have been sinking and tilting for centuries, requiring constant engineering attention to keep them stable. The ancient stones at the bottom, the volcanic basalt blocks of the Templo Mayor's foundations, are among the most solid things in the ground beneath the city, because they were laid on bedrock that the Mexica found and built down to with the patience and skill of engineers who intended their work to last. The colonial city above it is literally sinking into the ruins of the city it replaced, which is a kind of justice that history occasionally arranges without anyone intending it. There is a room in the National Museum of Anthropology in Chapultepec Park in Mexico City, the park that once held the Mexica Royal Retreat and the freshwater springs that fed the aqueducts of Tenochtitlan, where the Aztec sunstone is displayed. It is a massive carved disc of basalt, about 12 feet across and weighing approximately 24 tons, carved in the early 16th century, probably during the reign of Moctezuma Xocoyotzin. It is not, despite what the tour guides sometimes say, a calendar. Or rather, it is not only a calendar. It is a cosmological statement, an image of the Mexica understanding of time and destruction and creation, of the successive worlds or suns that had existed before the current one, each destroyed by a different catastrophe, a different failure of the relationship between the gods and the people, a different kind of ending. The central face on the stone is debated. It may be the sun god Tonatiuh, or it may be a death mask, or it may be an image of the earth monster, or it may be something more complex than any of those single identifications. Around the central face are the symbols of the previous 4 suns and their destructions: wind, rain, water, jaguar. And around those are the 20-day signs of the ritual calendar and the symbols of the cardinal directions, and the symbol of the 5th sun, the current world, the world the Mexica understood themselves to inhabit and to sustain through their sacrifices and their rituals and their obligations to the divine order that kept the sun rising each morning. They believed the world required maintenance. They believed that the cosmos was not a self-sustaining mechanism, but a relationship, a constant negotiation between the human and the divine. And that if the human side of the negotiation failed, the world would end. The sacrifices, the blood that was offered at the top of the Templo Mayor, were not expressions of cruelty or bloodlust, but were understood as the mechanism by which the relationship was maintained. The cost of the suns continued rising. This belief, so alien to the European Christian tradition that encountered it, was seized upon immediately as evidence of barbarism, as the justification that the conquest was not destruction but liberation, that the people of Tenochtitlan had been slaves to a terrifying theology, and that the Spanish had freed them from it by destroying the civilization that produced it. This framing served the purposes of the conquest in the immediate term and shaped the way the story was told for centuries afterward. It is still present in some popular histories, less explicit but structurally present. The assumption that what was lost was not really worth mourning because what the Mexica believed was wrong. What is worth sitting with in the quiet hours when the noise of the contemporary world has faded enough to allow a longer view is the reality that every civilization produces a cosmology, a story about what the universe is and what human beings owe to it and each other. The Mexica cosmology was not more violent at the level of philosophical premise than the cosmology that produced the Inquisition or the Crusades or the slave trade. It was different in its specifics, different in its demands, different in who bore the cost of its requirements, but the premise that the universe requires something from human beings, that existence is not free, that the maintenance of the world involves sacrifice, is not a Mexica peculiarity. It is something close to a human universal, expressed in radically different vocabularies across radically different traditions. The Mexica vocabulary was distinctive. The calendar was different. The stone and the feather and the obsidian blade were different instruments. But the underlying intuition that something enormous is at stake and that human beings are implicated in it was not different in kind from what produced the cathedrals and the Crusades and the Inquisitions of the world that arrived on the causeway in November of 1519. This is not to make everything equivalent or to erase the genuine horrors of Mexica practice, the scale of human sacrifice in the later imperial period, which did increase in ways that troubled even some of the Mexica's neighbors and allied peoples. It is to suggest that the frame of barbarism versus civilization, of darkness versus light, which the conquest deployed and which continued to be deployed for centuries in the telling of this story, is a frame that serves the purposes of the powerful and obscures the complexity of what was actually there. What was actually there was a civilization of extraordinary achievement and genuine cruelty and profound artistic sensibility and brutal military pragmatism and ecological sophistication and social inequality and intellectual accomplishment and terrible internal contradictions, which is to say it was a civilization. It was a thing that human beings built over centuries, with all the brilliance and violence and beauty and suffering that human building involves, and it was destroyed, and the world is poorer for its absence, in ways that we are only beginning to be able to fully articulate. To understand what was lost, you have to understand what was there. Not the war, not the politics, not the sequence of military decisions that led from November 1519 to August 1521, but the actual texture of daily life in the city that stood at the center of the world the Mexica had built. History has a way of reducing civilizations to their most dramatic moments, to their wars and their rulers and their catastrophes, and in doing so, it empties them of the ordinary human weight that made them real. Tenochtitlan was not only a political capital and a military power, it was a place where people woke up each morning and went about their days in a context that had its own rhythms and textures and quiet beauties and everyday frustrations that deserved to be recovered, as much as such recovery is possible at this distance in time. The day in Tenochtitlan began before dawn. The Mexica understood time in a sophisticated and multi-layered way, running two separate but interlocking calendars simultaneously. There was the solar calendar, the Xiuhpohualli, which ran 365 days and was divided into 18 months of 20 days each, with 5 additional days at the end of the year that were considered particularly dangerous and inauspicious, a period when the world was in a kind of suspended uncertainty. And there was the ritual calendar, the Tonalpohualli, which ran 260 days and was used for divination, for the assignment of individual destiny, for the timing of religious ceremonies and the naming of children. The two calendars meshed in a 52-year cycle, the calendar round, at the end of which the two systems returned to their starting alignment, and this was understood as the most dangerous moment in cosmic time, the moment when the gods might decide not to continue the world, when the fires might go out and the darkness might win. The ceremony that marked the end of the calendar round, the new fire ceremony, involved the extinguishing of every fire in every hearth in the empire, and the waiting through the night, and the drilling of a new fire on the chest of a sacrificed warrior on the top of the Hill of the Star near Tenochtitlan, as the Pleiades reached their zenith, and if the fire caught, if the new flame appeared, the world would continue. Runners carried the new fire from the Hill of the Star to every temple in the empire, and from the temples back to every hearth. And when the fires were relit, the people celebrated with a relief that was completely genuine, because the cosmological stakes of the ceremony were understood to be real. The children of Tenochtitlan were born into this world of layered time and cosmic obligation, and their entry into it was marked with ceremony from the first moment of life. A midwife attended the birth, and the arrival of a new child was addressed with elaborate ritual speeches, formal and beautiful, expressing the ambivalence of welcome. Welcome to this difficult world, to this place of pain and hard work, to this life that is a dream and quickly passes. The speeches are preserved in collections of Nahuatl oratory compiled by Spanish missionaries in the early colonial period, and they are among the most remarkable literary documents of the pre-Columbian Americas, full of a philosophical melancholy about the nature of existence that would not be out of place in the Stoic philosophers or the wisdom literature of any major world tradition. A day sign reader, a Tonalpohualli, was consulted to read the child's birth date in the ritual calendar and determine the destiny that the position of that day in the 260-day cycle indicated. A good sign might suggest a destiny of greatness, of leadership, of long life. A bad sign might suggest difficulty, early death, moral failure. The reading was not entirely deterministic. A bad sign on a good day could be mitigated by the timing of the naming ceremony, by ritual interventions that shifted the balance of fate slightly in a more favorable direction. The idea was not that destiny was fixed absolutely, but that it was a landscape of probability, a field of forces that could be navigated by someone with the right knowledge. The Tonalpohualli provided that knowledge, and the parents provided the ritual attention to shift the landscape in the child's favor where possible. The naming ceremony itself, which took place 4 days after birth, was an occasion for the community. Water was sprinkled on the child's head, and the name was announced, and the child was presented to the 4 directions, to the sun and the earth, and placed briefly on the ground, in acknowledgement of its origins in the dust and its eventual return to it. The midwife made speeches, the elders made speeches, food was shared, the newborn's umbilical cord was saved. If the child was a boy, the cord would eventually be buried on a battlefield, encoding in the earth the destiny of a warrior. If the child was a girl, the cord would be buried under the hearthstone, encoding the destiny of one who would maintain the household fire. These were not merely symbolic gestures, they were understood as real interventions in the formation of destiny, as literal contributions to the shape of the future. The education of children in Tenochtitlan was one of the most structured and egalitarian in the pre-Columbian Americas, and one of the most remarkable educational systems in the world for its time. There were two types of schools. The Telpochali, the House of Youth, was the school for commoners, where boys learned the practical arts of war, the disciplines of the warrior, and the basic knowledge needed to function as adult members of the Kalpuli community. Agricultural techniques, civic obligations, the basic rituals of the religious calendar, the physical discipline and endurance that military service required. The Kalmakak was the school for the children of nobles and for selected, talented children of commoner families, where the curriculum was more demanding and more comprehensive. The full ritual calendar, with all its complexities, the history of the Mexica, from the wandering years through the building of the empire, astronomy and the movements of the heavenly bodies, the reading and writing of the pictographic manuscript tradition, rhetoric and oratory in the formal style that Nahuatl had developed to a high art, music, and the performance of the ceremonial songs that accompanied the great festivals, the law and its administration, the arts of governance and diplomacy. Girls had their own educational institutions, focused on textile production, which was not merely practical work but an art form of the highest prestige in the Mexica cultural system, and on the religious knowledge needed to participate fully in the ceremonial life of the community. The textiles of central Mexico in the pre-Columbian period were extraordinary objects, and not enough attention is paid to them in most popular histories of the Aztec Empire, perhaps because most of the textiles themselves did not survive the colonial period, while stone monuments and ceramic vessels are more durable and therefore more likely to have made it into museum collections. But the accounts of the tributary goods flowing into Tenochtitlan include enormous quantities of cloth, described in the tribute lists, with specifications about quality, color, weave, pattern, and fineness of thread that make clear that the Mexica and their subject peoples had developed a textile tradition of enormous sophistication. The looms used were backstrap looms, weaving technology very different from the European loom, requiring the weaver to use her own body tension to control the warp threads, resulting in a direct physical relationship between the weaver and the cloth that European loom weaving did not involve in the same way. The cotton was grown on tribute farms in the warmer lowland areas and transported to the highland cities where the weaving was done. Designs included complex geometric patterns, figures of animals and deities, representations of the day, signs of the calendar, all woven directly into the fabric rather than printed or embroidered onto it afterward. The production of a single elaborate cloth could take weeks or months of skilled labor, and the finest cloth was a luxury commodity that functioned as a store of value, a medium of exchange, a mark of status, and an offering to the gods. The featherwork of Tenochtitlan was even more explicitly an art form at the highest level of cultural achievement. The Amantika, the featherworkers, were their own specialized guild, with their own Kalpuli and their own patron deity, and the objects they produced, headdresses and shields and cloaks and fans constructed from the feathers of tropical birds, were among the most prized luxury goods in the Mesoamerican world. The Quetzal bird, whose long iridescent green tail feathers were the most valued of all, was kept in royal aviaries and carefully managed, as were the scarlet macaws and the blue cotingas and the roseate spoonbills and the many other birds whose feathers went into the most elaborate compositions. The feathers were woven and glued onto frameworks of cotton, bone, and wood using adhesive made from orchid corms, layered in precise sequences to achieve the shimmering effects that made the finished objects seem to be alive with light. The famous feathered headdress, now kept in the Museum of Ethnology in Vienna, known popularly as Moctezuma's headdress, though its exact provenance is disputed, is made of over 400 Quetzal feathers, each one averaging around 40 centimeters in length, arranged in a fan around a base of gold and turquoise and cotinga feathers. It is one of the most spectacular objects to have survived from the pre-Columbian Americas, and it exists in Vienna rather than Mexico because it was sent as a diplomatic gift to the European monarchies in the years immediately following the conquest, part of the first shipments of Mexican treasures to the Spanish court. The gold and silver work of Tenochtitlan was equally sophisticated, though almost none of it survived the conquest intact because the Spanish melted it down immediately to recover the metal. The goldsmiths, the Tolteca, were another specialized guild, working in the tradition of lost wax casting and sheet gold working that had been developed over centuries in central Mexico, producing objects of extraordinary delicacy. Figurines of animals and deities, lip plugs and earrings and nose ornaments for the nobility, ceremonial vessels, and the gold discs and figures that astonished the Spanish when they first saw them, and that constituted the majority of the famous gift sent to Spain after the conquest. The Spanish king Carlos I showed the objects to the artist Albrecht Dürer, who saw them in Brussels in 1520, and Dürer wrote in his diary that he had never in his life seen things that rejoiced his heart so as these, that they were far more wonderful and beautiful than anything he would have expected from a new world, and that the people who made them must have been men of great subtlety of spirit. Dürer understood, in that moment, that something extraordinary had come into contact with his world. The objects were melted down shortly afterward. The music of Tenochtitlan is perhaps the most completely lost of all its arts, because music by its nature leaves no artifact, only the instruments and the records of what the performance required. The Mexica musical tradition included percussion instruments of many kinds. The huehuetel, a tall vertical drum made from a hollow log with a skin head, which could produce different tones depending on where on the head it was struck. The teponaztli, a horizontal slit drum carved from a single piece of wood with two tongues of different lengths that produced two distinct pitches when struck. Tortoiseshell drums, rattles made from dried gourds and from copper bells, scrapers of bone and shell. There were wind instruments, flutes of clay and bone and wood, ocarinas, conch trumpets, and panpipes. The performance of these instruments in the context of the great festivals was not casual or improvisational. It was trained, ritualized, precise, with specific songs and rhythms required for specific ceremonies, learned in the educational institutions from an early age, and maintained by specialists whose job was the preservation and performance of the musical tradition. The songs themselves, the cuicatl, were a major literary form in Nahuatl, with a sophisticated poetic tradition that used imagery and metaphor in ways that scholars of Nahuatl literature have spent generations trying to fully translate, partly because so much of the meaning was embedded in the specific cultural and cosmological context that the songs assumed their audience shared. Flower and song, in Xochitl in Cuicatl, was the Nahuatl phrase for poetry, for art, for the highest form of human expression. The metaphor says something. Beauty and meaning were understood as inseparable, as two aspects of the same fundamental human activity of making the world legible. The gardens and aviaries of Tenochtitlan deserve particular attention, because they represent an aspect of the city that the Spanish accounts describe with consistent admiration, and that modern discussions of the city sometimes overlook in favor of the more dramatic elements of temples and warfare. Moctezuma maintained extensive gardens outside the city, at the royal retreat of Texcoatzinco and at other locations around the valley, where plants from across the empire were cultivated, collected, and studied. The garden at Huaxtepec, in the modern state of Morelos, brought to Moctezuma's attention by the physician and botanist Martin de la Cruz. It was famous for its plants, from the lowland tropics transplanted to the highland garden through careful attention to soil and water and drainage conditions. The Mexica practice of botanical collection was not simply aesthetic, it was connected to the medical tradition, to the knowledge of plants as medicines, as the material from which the healers worked. The Mexica medical tradition, the Tizatl, was sophisticated enough that Spanish physicians in the early colonial period documented and tried to learn from it, recognizing that the indigenous knowledge of plant medicine, in many cases, exceeded what the European tradition had developed independently. particularly for conditions and plants specific to the American environment. The aviaries, the royal collections of birds from across the empire, were similarly both aesthetic and scientific in their orientation. Live birds were kept not only for their feathers, but as objects of observation and study. The variety of species maintained in the royal aviaries at Tenochtitlan, described by the Spanish soldiers who saw them, included birds from tropical jungle and mountain cloud forest and coastline and desert, brought together in a single location where they could be observed at close range. Whether or not the Mexica had a concept of natural history equivalent to what was developing in European thought in the same period, they clearly had extensive knowledge of the natural world accumulated through generations of observation, and the practice of bringing specimens together in a controlled setting for observation is not dissimilar in its basic logic from what natural historians in Europe were beginning to do in the same century. The ball game, the ulamilistli, was another aspect of Mexica culture that the Spanish observed and described and found simultaneously fascinating and disturbing. The rubber ball game was not an invention of the Mexica. It was ancient in Mesoamerica, dating back at least to the 2nd millennium BCE in the lowland regions where rubber trees grew, and it had been played in some form by virtually every major civilization in the region for thousands of years. By the time of Tenochtitlan, the ball game had both a popular entertainment form, played casually in smaller courts, and a high ritual form played in the large formal ball courts that were part of every major civic complex. The ritual game involved teams of 2 or more players attempting to pass a heavy, solid rubber ball through a stone ring mounted vertically on the wall of the ball court, using only the hips and knees and elbows. This is extraordinarily difficult to do, given the weight of the rubber ball and the fixed height of the ring, and successful shots through the ring were apparently rare enough to be celebrated. The cosmological significance of the game was connected to the movements of heavenly bodies, to the rising and setting of the sun, and the appearance and disappearance of Venus, and the outcome of the ritual game had divinatory significance. Accounts differ about whether the sacrificial component of the game involved the winning team or the losing team, and scholars have not fully resolved this question, though the more recent consensus leans toward the winning team being the ones associated with the sacrifice. The market at Tlatelolco, which has already been described in something of its scale and variety, deserves more attention as a social and cultural institution, because what happened there was not simply the exchange of goods, it was the meeting point of the entire social and geographic range of the empire. The market day brought to a single location the products of the lowland tropics and the highland plateaus and the coastal regions and the distant tribute territories, and the people who produced and traded those products moved with them, so that the market was a place where you could encounter speakers of dozens of different languages, representatives of dozens of different cultural traditions, people whose daily lives in their home communities bore very little resemblance to each other, all gathered under the implicit social contract of the market peace. Disputes in the market were adjudicated by a court that operated continuously on market days, staffed by judges who were specialists in commercial law, able to resolve questions about the quality of goods, the validity of contracts, the appropriate exchange rates between different trade goods. This was not an informal system. It was an institution with defined procedures and enforceable outcomes, embedded in a commercial culture sophisticated enough to require it. The currencies of the market were multiple, reflecting the complexity of a system that had to accommodate transactions ranging from small everyday purchases to major trade in luxury goods. The cacao bean was the most common small denomination currency, stable enough in its value that it could function as a medium of exchange for ordinary transactions. Cotton cloth was a higher value unit, used for larger transactions, and also as a store of value that could be transported and held without deteriorating. Feathers and gold dust functioned at the high end of the value scale, used primarily in transactions among merchants and nobles. The Spanish were confused by this system initially, looking for coins that they recognized from European commercial practice and finding instead a commodity money system that was less familiar to them but functionally capable of supporting the enormous commercial volume of the Tlatelolco market. The merchants who operated in this system were a specialized class with their own identity, their own rituals, their own patron deity, their own internal hierarchy. The Pochteca were long-distance traders who traveled routes extending far beyond the boundaries of the Triple Alliance into the distant lowland regions where tropical luxury goods were produced, carrying highland products outward and bringing back feathers and jade and cacao and other items that the Mexica elite desired. The Pochteca traveled in organized caravans, heavily protected, operating under the protection of the god Yaxcatecutli, the Lord of the Nose, whose name connected him to the idea of leading the way, going before. They were sophisticated actors in the political and economic networks of Mesoamerica, gathering intelligence as they traveled, establishing relationships with distant communities, sometimes serving as the advanced scouts of Mexica political expansion into new territory. The information they brought back from their travels was valuable in ways that extended far beyond the commercial. Cortés, when he arrived in Mexico, found in the Pochteca network a pre-existing system of intelligence and communication that extended across the geography of the empire, and some of his most useful early information about the interior came through channels that connected ultimately to this network. The religious life of Tenochtitlan was organized around a calendar of festivals that structured the year into a sequence of ceremonial occasions, each associated with particular deities, particular ritual requirements, particular agricultural events. The 18 months of the solar calendar each had their own festival, often named for the deity honored in that month, and the festivals involved the entire community in ways that cut across social class and neighborhood affiliation. The priests, the Tlamatcalque, were the specialists who maintained the ritual calendar and performed the ceremonies, but the performances were not private. They were public events in which the entire population participated as witnesses, and in many cases as active performers, through the communal dances and songs and processions that were integral to most of the major festivals. The great ceremonial precinct at the center of Tenochtitlan, the walled enclosure within which the Templo Mayor and its associated temples stood, was the stage for the most important of these performances, and it was a stage visible from much of the city. The priests lived apart from the general population, in the temple compounds where they maintained the sacred fires and performed the daily rituals of care for the divine images and observance of the ritual calendar. They were trained from childhood in the Calmecac, and their life was one of rigorous discipline, fasting, bloodletting as self-sacrifice, maintenance of celibacy in the periods required by their office, the study and preservation of the knowledge of the calendars and the rituals and the stories of the gods. The highest priests, the Quetzalcoatl priests, whose titles invoked the name of the feathered serpent, were among the most powerful figures in Mexica society, and their judgment on questions of ritual propriety and divine favor had real political weight. The astronomy of the Mexica was both practical and cosmological, embedded in the ritual calendar system in ways that made the study of the sky inseparable from the religious and civic life of the community. The movements of Venus were tracked with particular care, because Venus, as morning star and evening star, was associated with Quetzalcoatl, and the heliacal rising and setting of Venus marked significant moments in the ritual calendar. The observatory at the city of Xochicalco, south of Tenochtitlan, has a shaft cut through the ceiling of an underground chamber that allows a beam of sunlight to fall on a marking on the floor precisely at the solar zenith, which occurs twice a year in these latitudes, a form of astronomical instrument, cut directly into stone. The Templo Mayor itself was oriented so that at the equinoxes, the sun rose directly between the two shrines at its summit, the one dedicated to Huitzilopochtli and the one dedicated to Tlaloc, the rain god, the sun passing in that moment between war and rain, between the two great forces on which the life of the city depended. This alignment was not accidental, it was precise, and precision at that scale requires generations of careful astronomical observation and the mathematical sophistication to translate that observation into architectural planning. The concept of Tlaloc, the rain god, is worth pausing on, because it opens a window into the way the Mexica understood the relationship between the human community and the natural world. Tlaloc was ancient, far older than the Mexica themselves, a deity shared across the highland cultures of central Mexico going back thousands of years, whose iconography appears on monuments of the classic period, a millennium before Tenochtitlan was built. The children offered in the ceremonies associated with Tlaloc, a practice documented in the Spanish accounts and confirmed by archaeological evidence at the Templo Mayor, where the remains of sacrificed children have been found, were understood to be sent to Tlaloc's paradise, a lush and well-watered afterlife called Tlalocan, which was the destination of those who died by drowning or lightning or disease connected to water, and which was understood as a beautiful and peaceful place, not a punishment. The grief of the sacrifice was real. The accounts make clear that the children were mourned, but the meaning of the sacrifice was not punishment or cruelty, but maintenance, the payment required by the cosmic contract that kept the rains coming, that kept the crops growing, that kept the civilization alive. The theology was not alien in its premise, only in its specific demands. The afterlife beliefs of the Mexica were more complex and more varied than the single image of sacrifice and blood that popular history tends to present. The destination of the dead depended on how they died, not on how they lived in any moral sense. Warriors who died in battle or on the sacrifice stone went to accompany the sun as it crossed the sky from dawn to noon, spending 4 years as hummingbirds and butterflies before returning to earth as those creatures. Women who died in childbirth were also warriors, because birth was understood as a battle and they accompanied the sun in its journey from noon to dusk. People who drowned or were struck by lightning or died of certain diseases associated with rain went to Tlalocan, the paradise of the rain god. The great majority of ordinary people who died of old age or illness went to Mictlan, the underworld, a 9-level journey that took 4 years to complete, guided by a dog companion buried with the dead, requiring passage through a series of challenges and obstacles before the soul reached its final rest in the deepest level. The journey required ritual provisions, food and tools and clothing burned at the funeral and sent with the dead through the smoke. Just as the journey required a guide, the dog, and the help of the living community in maintaining the ritual obligations that eased the passage. The colour of the Templo Mayor, which is today a ruin of grey stone and ancient plaster, was in its living form a dazzling assault of colour. The surfaces of the pyramid were painted, the shrines at the top were painted, the sculptures that adorned the structure were painted, in the full range of colours that the Mexica painters had access to. Mineral pigments producing blues and greens, and reds and yellows of great intensity, white plaster providing the base, black outlines defining the figures with the precision that Mexica pictorial art required. The whole structure would have appeared, from across the lake or from the causeway as you entered the city, as a mass of colour and geometry rising against the sky above the lower rooflines of the residential neighbourhoods, its imagery visible from distances at which the specific figures were indistinct, but the overall statement of power and sacred presence was unmistakable. The sounds of the city were equally intense. The great drum at the top of the Templo Mayor, the huhutel, was said to be audible from miles away, its deep resonance carrying across the lake. During the festivals, the city filled with the sounds of percussion and flute and the singing of thousands of voices in the communal dances. The market filled every day with the noise of 60,000 voices, of haggling and laughter, and the cries of vendors, and the movement of the canoes through the market's water channels. The birds in the aviaries added their songs to the ambient sound of the city. The causeways carried the constant movement of feet, of the carriers who transported goods across the city without wheeled vehicles or draft animals, because central Mexico before the Spanish had neither, carrying everything on their backs, with the tumpline across the forehead, that was the standard carrying technology of the region, a technology that allowed the movement of extraordinary weights over long distances, but that left permanent marks on the bodies of the people who practiced it from childhood. The canal water lapped against the stone canal walls in a rhythm that was always present, underneath the other sounds, as constant as breath. The smell of the city was the smell of copal incense, which burned continuously in the temples and at household shrines, its resinous smoke rising in thin columns from every neighborhood simultaneously, a smell associated with the sacred, with the presence of the divine in the everyday world, with the maintenance of the relationship between the human and the cosmic. It was the smell of maize cooking, of the tortillas and tamales and other preparations that formed the dietary base of the population, produced in every household from before dawn. When the sound of the grinding stone, the metate, was the sound that marked the beginning of the day. It was the smell of the canals, which carried the city's waste toward the chinampas, but also carried fresh fish and fresh flowers and fresh vegetables, the produce of the lake and the gardens arriving each morning at the market. It was the smell of the lake itself, the particular mineral smell of a high-altitude lake, present at the edges of the city, where the stone causeways met the open water, a smell that would have been one of the defining sensory signatures of the place for everyone who lived there. All of that is gone. Not metaphorically gone, not conceptually absent, but physically, materially gone, replaced by something entirely different, by the concrete and asphalt and diesel exhaust, and the particular kind of noise that a 22 million person urban agglomeration produces. A noise so constant and so pervasive that the people who live inside it often stop consciously registering it, the way people who have always lived near a waterfall stop hearing the water. Underneath that noise, underground, in the foundations that the metro tunnels cut through and the utility trenches expose and the archaeological excavations reveal in their careful grid squares, the old city persists. It insists. The Templo Mayor, stones under the cathedral, stones under the colonial plaza, under the modern concrete, each layer pressed against the one above and below, preserving through compression what could not be preserved through protection. The archaeological work at the Templo Mayor site, which was named a UNESCO World Heritage Site as part of the Historic Center of Mexico City in 1987, has produced a picture of the sacred precinct that is far more detailed than anything the Spanish accounts provided. The offerings found in the successive construction phases of the pyramid span the history of the empire, from the earliest layers dating to the late 14th century, through the final rebuilding completed just before the Spanish arrived. Each offering cache was buried at a specific location in the temple structure with deliberate care, objects placed in precise arrangements that reflected the cosmological meaning of the offering. Marine shells from the Gulf Coast and the Pacific, objects from hundreds of kilometers in every direction, stone masks from cultures 1,000 years older than the Mexica themselves, repurposed and recontextualized as part of the Mexica cosmological framework. The offerings speak of a civilization that was intensely aware of the depth of time it inhabited, that understood itself as part of a longer history reaching back before its own arrival in the valley, that collected and preserved and reinterpreted the objects of earlier cultures in ways that suggest something like a historical consciousness, a deliberate engagement with the past as a resource for understanding the present. The voices of the Mexica themselves, the people who lived in Tenochtitlan and who survived the fall, have reached us in fragments that are all the more valuable for being partial. The Spanish missionaries who came after the soldiers were complicated figures, motivated by a genuine desire to convert the indigenous population to Christianity, and equally motivated, in some cases, by a genuine curiosity about the civilization they were in the process of overwriting. Fray Bernardino de Sahagún, a Franciscan priest who arrived in Mexico in 1529, only 8 years after the fall of Tenochtitlan, spent the next 60 years of his life working with Nahuatl-speaking informants to document as completely as possible the religion, the history, the natural history, the social organization, the arts, the languages, the rhetoric, the ceremonies, and the everyday life of the pre-Columbian Mexica world. His great work, The General History of the Things of New Spain, which is now called the Florentine Codex, is a massive 12-volume encyclopedic account, written in parallel Nahuatl and Spanish columns, illustrated with drawings produced by indigenous artists working under his direction. It is one of the most extraordinary ethnographic documents ever produced, and it was produced under conditions of paradox that Sahagún himself was aware of. He was a representative of the power that had destroyed the civilization he was documenting, using the tools of that power, writing in the language of that power, working within an institutional framework that was simultaneously trying to convert the people whose knowledge he was trying to preserve. His informants were men who had been children or young adults at the time of the conquest, who remembered the old world directly or through the immediate oral tradition of their parents and teachers, who were navigating in their own lives the terrible transition between what had been and what was now being imposed. What they told Sahagún, what they allowed to be written down, was both extraordinary and selective, shaped by the context in which it was produced, by the knowledge of what the Spanish authorities would find acceptable and what they would find threatening. There is a document in the Florentine Codex, in the 12th book, which deals with the conquest itself, that contains the Mexica account of the fall of Tenochtitlan. It is one of the most important texts in the history of the Americas, and it is also one of the most devastating, because what it describes is not the conquest as a military event, narrated from a distance with the language of strategy and politics and historical causation, but the conquest as an experience, as something that happened to people, told in a voice that is trying to hold together the memory of destruction and find language adequate to what cannot quite be said. The passage most often quoted in histories of the conquest describes the aftermath of the fall, the survivors walking through the ruins of the city, and it says something like this, in rough translation from Nahuatl. And with this, the war ended. Flowers and songs and weeping for Tlatelolco, water and mire in places we walked. Arrows were broken, hair was disheveled, the houses were unroofed, the walls red. Worms crawl in the streets and in the squares, and walls are spattered with brains. The water is red as if it were dyed, and we drink it so. We eat compressed earth, we eat lizards, we eat mice, rats and worms. We eat the dirt. The flour of corn was no more. The passage is not a historical account in the European sense. It is a lament, a formal literary form in Nahuatl tradition, the Ixnocuacatl, the orphan song, the song of grief and loss, which had its own conventions and its own emotional logic. But the details it contains are not merely conventional. The worms and the walls splattered with brains, and the drinking of red water and the eating of earth. These are the specific memories of specific people recorded within a generation of the events, preserved in a language that was itself under pressure, in a document produced under the supervision of a priest of the power that had produced the conditions being described. That these words exist at all is a kind of miracle, or if you do not use that word, a kind of stubbornness, the human refusal to be fully silenced, even when the conditions for speaking have been systematically dismantled. The Nahuatl literary tradition that produced that lament did not end with the conquest. It changed, absorbed new influences, developed new forms to address new realities, but it continued. The genre of Nahuatl poetry that scholars call the Songs of Nezahualcóyotl, after the great poet king of Texcoco, who lived in the 15th century before the Spanish arrived, preserved in colonial period manuscripts, contains some of the most beautiful and philosophically rich poetry produced in the Americas. Poems that meditate on the transience of earthly things, on the relationship between the human and the divine, on the function of beauty and art, in a world defined by impermanence. Nezahualcóyotl, who was a contemporary of Moctezuma I, and who ruled Texcoco at a time when it was one of the intellectual capitals of Mesoamerica, is credited with philosophical innovations that move towards something like monotheism, a conception of a single divine force. Tloque, Nahuake, the Lord of the close vicinity, the one who is everywhere present, that existed alongside and in tension with the conventional polytheism of Mexica religious practice. Whether these poems are accurately attributed to him or represent a later tradition organized under his name, as some scholars argue, they constitute a literary tradition of extraordinary richness that deserves to be read alongside the poetry of any other civilization that historians put forward as exemplars of human intellectual achievement. The colonial period in Mexico was not the end of Nahuatl cultural production, it was a transformation of it. Indigenous painters continued to produce manuscripts in the Codex tradition, now using European paper and the Latin alphabet, alongside the pictographic tradition, creating hybrid documents that negotiated between two representational systems. Indigenous nobles, using the legal frameworks of the colonial system, wrote petitions and histories and genealogies in Nahuatl that preserved information about the pre-conquest past and made arguments about property rights and community obligations rooted in that past. The Tlatoani of subject communities, operating within the colonial hierarchy as intermediaries between the Spanish administration and the indigenous population, maintained aspects of the Calpulli system that gave them a degree of control over local affairs. The religious life of the communities absorbed Christianity in ways that were not simple replacement of one belief system with another, but complex synthesis and accommodation, producing forms of practice that the Spanish missionaries found imperfectly converted and indigenous communities found livable, a negotiated middle ground that allowed the continuation of certain relationships with the sacred world under a Christian surface. The Virgin of Guadalupe is the most famous product of this process of synthesis and accommodation, and it is a story that begins in December of 1531, only 10 years after the fall of Tenochtitlan, on the hill of Tepeyac, north of Mexico City, where the Mexica goddess Tonantzin, the Earth Mother, had been venerated. According to the tradition that formed around the event, a recently converted indigenous man named Juan Diego encountered a woman who identified herself as the Virgin Mary, who spoke to him in Nahuatl, and who left an image of herself miraculously imprinted on his cloak when he carried roses from the hill to the bishop as proof of the encounter. The image on the cloak, which is now venerated in the Basilica of Guadalupe, north of Mexico City, one of the most visited pilgrimage sites in the world, has been subjected to extensive scientific analysis over the decades, and the analysis has produced results ranging from the entirely naturalistic to the entirely mysterious, depending on which analyst you ask. But the theological and cultural significance of Guadalupe is not primarily a question of the physical properties of the cloak. It is a question of what it meant for the indigenous population of Mexico to have a sacred presence who looked like them, who spoke their language, who appeared on a hill where their goddess had been worshipped, who offered a point of connection between the world that had been destroyed and the world they were being required to inhabit. Guadalupe became, over the centuries, the central devotional figure of Mexican Catholicism, the spiritual mother of the nation, invoked by independence leaders in the 19th century and by revolutionary movements in the 20th, carrying all the accumulated weight of 5 centuries of indigenous and mestizo religious feeling. The word mestizo, which now describes the majority of Mexico's population, refers to people of mixed European and indigenous ancestry, and the process of mestizaje, of mixing, was not gradual or peaceful or primarily voluntary. It was the demographic consequence of the conquest, of the catastrophic population decline that wiped out perhaps 90% of the indigenous population of Mexico in the century following the arrival of the Spanish, not primarily through direct violence, but through epidemic disease, through the disruption of the agricultural systems that fed the population, through the labor demands of the colonial economy, through the social disorganization that followed the destruction of the institutions of the Old World. The population of central Mexico in 1520 has been estimated at somewhere between 15 and 25 million people, a range reflecting the genuine uncertainty of the sources. By 1600, it may have been as low as 1 million. The specific numbers are less important than the order of magnitude. This was one of the largest demographic collapses in human history, comparable in proportional terms to the Black Death in Europe, but concentrated in a much shorter time, and without the eventual recovery that the European population made. The recovery of the indigenous and mestizo population of Mexico took centuries and is still, in some regions, ongoing. The hacienda system that replaced the Chinampa system of the valley was not simply a different method of agricultural organization. It was a different relationship between people and land, between labor and ownership, between the individual and the community. The Calpulli system, in which communal land was managed by the clan group and distributed to members according to need and obligation, was replaced over the colonial period by the encomienda and later the hacienda, in which land was owned by Spanish colonists or the church and worked by indigenous laborers who were bound to it by debt and by legal structures that made departure nearly impossible. The productivity of the Valley of Mexico declined under this system, partly because the sophisticated water management of the Chinampa system was not maintained, and partly because the colonial economic structure was oriented toward extraction for export rather than toward sustaining the local population. The flooding that had been controlled by the Mexica through the system of dikes and canals became a chronic problem for the colonial city, leading ultimately to the decision to drain the lakes entirely, a project that was undertaken over 3 centuries and completed in the 20th century, transforming the Valley of Mexico from a lake landscape to a basin city whose aquifer is being drawn down faster than it can be recharged, causing the city to sink at rates measured in centimeters per year in the most affected neighborhoods. The sinking of Mexico City is one of the more literal ways in which the consequences of the conquest continue to be physically present in the landscape. The colonial builders who drained the lake and built their city on the exposed lake bed created a structure sitting on waterlogged clay that compresses under weight, and the weight of 22 million people and the infrastructure required to support them is considerable. The Metropolitan Cathedral has been sinking since it was built, tilting in different directions at different rates depending on the density of the subsoil beneath different parts of its foundation, requiring constant engineering intervention to prevent the structure from collapsing. Some of the oldest colonial buildings in the historic center have sunk several meters from their original street level, so that what was once the first floor is now a basement, and the original street level is accessible only through archaeological excavation. The city is eating itself, slowly, the weight of the present pressing down into the past. The excavations that this sinking forces, the utility trenches and metro tunnels and building foundations that cut into the earth, keep revealing the old city. The discovery, in 1978, of the Coyolxauhqui stone, a massive carved disc depicting the moon goddess in her dismembered state, found by workers from the electric company digging a trench near the main plaza, led to the excavation of the Templo Mayor and the creation of the on-site museum that now displays the finds from successive seasons of archaeological work. Since 1978, the Templo Mayor project has been ongoing, expanding the excavated area, finding new offering caches, recovering new information about the construction history of the pyramid and the nature of the ceremonies that took place there. Each offering cache, carefully excavated and documented, adds to the picture of what the Mexica understood about the relationship between the human and the divine, what they offered and why, what they valued enough to bury in the foundations of their most sacred place. The offerings include the expected: jade and turquoise and gold and obsidian and featherwork fragments. But they also include the surprising: stone masks and figurines from the Olmec culture, which flourished on the Gulf Coast 1,500 years before the Mexica built Tenochtitlan, repurposed as offerings in a context that gives them new meaning, evidence of the Mexica engagement with the deep past of the civilization they were part of. They include coral and marine organisms from both coasts, transported hundreds of miles inland. They include the complete skeleton of a golden eagle buried with offerings placed on its body as if it were a human warrior. They include the remains of crocodiles, wolves, jaguars, mountain lions, brought from across the empire to be included in the sacred economy of the Templo Mayor. The Templo Mayor Museum, opened in 1987, houses these finds in a building constructed beside the excavated ruins of the pyramid itself, so that you can look through the museum windows at the actual stones of the structure while examining in the gallery cases the objects found within those stones. The museum is one of the most important archaeological museums in the Americas, and visiting it produces a specific kind of temporal vertigo that is hard to describe to someone who has not experienced it. The sense of standing at a point where multiple layers of time are simultaneously present, where the objects under glass were placed in the ground by specific people on a specific day in the 14th or 15th century, and were recovered by other specific people on a specific day in the 20th or 21st century, and the gap between those two specific days contains the entire catastrophe of the conquest and the colonial period, and the independence and the revolution and the modern city pressing down from above. The Coyolxauhqui stone itself, which is the centerpiece of the museum's ground floor, is a work of art that rewards long looking. It is about 3.5 meters in diameter, carved from a single block of andesite, and it depicts the moon goddess, Coyolxauhqui, in a state of dismemberment, her body broken into pieces, arranged around a central core in the specific posture of someone who has been killed and fragmented. The myth of her dismemberment is one of the central narratives of Mexica cosmology. Coyolxauhqui and her 400 brothers, the Sensen Huitznahuac, the 400 Southerners, attacked their mother Coatlicue on the hill of Coatepec because she had become pregnant in circumstances that the myth describes as miraculous by a ball of feathers that fell from the sky. As they attacked her, the child in her womb, Huitzilopochtli, the hummingbird of the south, was born fully armed and immediately defeated all of his siblings, killing Coyolxauhqui and hurling her dismembered body down the hill. This myth of the battle at Coatepec was reenacted in the ceremonies of the Templo Maya, which was understood as the embodiment of Coatepec, the hill where the sun god was born and triumphed over the moon and the stars, as the sun triumphs each morning when it rises and the night retreats. The Coyolxauhqui stone was found at the base of the staircase of the Templo Maya's Huitzilopochtli shrine, in the position where the dismembered body would have been after being thrown down the hill. It was placed there to make the temple itself into the myth, to turn the performance of the ceremony at the top of the pyramid into a literal reenactment of the cosmic event that the myth described. Looking at the Coyolxauhqui stone and knowing this context changes the experience of looking at it. It is no longer a decorative object or a historical artifact in the passive sense. It is a functional element of a cosmological system, a piece of a larger argument about the nature of the universe and the relationship between the forces that structure it, rendered in stone with extraordinary skill and placed with extraordinary precision in a specific location for a specific purpose. The craft of the carving is visible in every detail: the careful articulation of the body parts, the serpent skin skirt, the bells on the cheeks that give the goddess her name, the disc at the center of the composition that may be an earth symbol or a naval symbol, or both simultaneously. The carver, or carvers, who produced this stone were working in a tradition that had developed specific conventions for representing the body in this kind of cosmic context. Conventions that are fully legible once you understand the tradition, and completely mysterious once you do not. One of the things the Conquest destroyed was the tradition of trained viewers who could read these objects in their full complexity without effort, the way a reader reads a text without consciously decoding each letter. The recovery of that ability to read is ongoing, incomplete, and may never be fully achieved. What scholars of the pre-Columbian Americas have accomplished in the century and a half since serious archaeological and textual study began is remarkable. The decipherment of much of the Nahuatl textual tradition, the reconstruction of the ritual calendar system, the mapping of the Triple Alliance's political structure and tribute network, the analysis of the architectural and artistic traditions, the recovery of the daily life details from the Florentine Codex and other colonial period documents, the excavation of major sites across the geography of the empire. But the recovery is inherently partial, built on the fragments that survived the destruction, and every reconstruction is also an interpretation, shaped by the assumptions and limitations of the scholars doing the reconstructing. The picture of Tenochtitlan that exists in historical scholarship today is more complete and more accurate than the picture that existed 50 years ago, and the picture 50 years from now will be more complete and more accurate than the one today, as new excavations and new analytical techniques and new generations of scholars bring different questions to the material. This is how history works at its best, as a continuous conversation between the present and the past. Neither one fully understanding the other, but both changed by the attempt. There is a question that this entire story keeps circling around without quite landing on directly, and it is worth trying to address it before the night gets any later. The question is, what does it mean to mourn something that ended 500 years ago? What is the appropriate relationship between the people of the present and a civilization that ended before any of their grandparents were born? A civilization that most of them have only a genealogical connection to, not a lived one? Is the mourning real? Is it performative? Is it useful? For the indigenous communities of Mexico, the question is less abstract than it is for most. The Nahuatl-speaking communities of Morelos and Hidalgo and Puebla and the state of Mexico, the communities maintaining versions of the ceremonial calendar, the communities whose relationship to the land they inhabit is still mediated by practices with roots in the pre-Columbian world. The question of continuity and rupture and loss is not historical. It is lived. It is present. The fall of Tenochtitlan is not, for these communities, something that happened. It is something that continues to happen in the land tenure systems and the political structures and the economic conditions of the world they inhabit, shaped by 500 years of consequences flowing from the events of August 1521. For the broader population of Mexico, and for the world outside Mexico that has some relationship to this history, the question of mourning is more difficult. There is a tradition of mourning in the Mexican national culture that is formalized in the calendar, the Day of the Dead, Dia de los Muertos, which is observed on November 1st and 2nd, and which has roots in both pre-Columbian indigenous practice and the Catholic observances of All Saints and All Souls Day, is a ceremony of remembrance and reconciliation, with loss that takes place in cemeteries and in homes across the country, and that has become, in recent decades, internationally recognized as a particular Mexican cultural achievement. The ofrenda, the offering altar, the marigold flowers, the sugar skulls, the photographs of the dead, the food and drink prepared for the returning spirits. These are the material elements of a practice that insists on the presence of the dead in the world of the living, that refuses the clean separation between past and present that most modern secular culture assumes. The practice is syncretic, mixing indigenous and Catholic elements in proportions that vary by region and by family. But in its deepest logic, it preserves something from the Mexica understanding of the dead, the idea that the boundary between the living and the dead is permeable, that the dead retain a relationship with the living community, that remembrance is not merely sentimental, but is a form of maintenance, keeping the relationship alive through the act of marking it. That sense of maintenance, of the relationship with the past, as something requiring active attention rather than passive reception, may be the most important thing to carry from the story of Tenochtitlan into the present. The city was built by people who understood themselves as responsible for the continuation of the world, who believed that the sun rose each morning because of their ritual attention to the relationship between the human and the divine. That belief took specific forms that are not recoverable and not desirable to recover in their specific original form. But the underlying orientation, the sense of active responsibility for what continues to exist, is one that the contemporary world has not found an adequate replacement for. The lake is drained. The Chinampa gardens are mostly gone, though some remain in Xochimilco in the southern part of the city, now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, the last working remnant of the agricultural system that fed the greatest city in the pre-Columbian Americas. The aqueducts are gone. The birds that filled the aviaries are in many cases gone from the region, their populations reduced by the habitat destruction that has accompanied the expansion of the city across the valley. The volcanic ash soil that Bernal Diaz described as so fertile that the olive trees grew strong and heavy with fruit is under concrete that extends from one side of the valley to the other. And yet, the language persists, the foods persist, the corn and the beans and the chilies and the chocolate and the tomatoes and the avocados that are now part of the diet of the entire world, carried outward from the agricultural tradition of pre-Columbian Mexico, domesticated by generations of farmers in the highlands and lowlands of what is now Mexico over thousands of years before the Spanish arrived. The calendar persists in fragments, the Day of the Dead and the agricultural festivals of the rural communities and the ceremonial knowledge maintained by the tradition keepers of the surviving indigenous communities. The poetry persists, the songs of Nezahualcóyotl translated now into dozens of languages, speaking across 5 centuries, and the catastrophe of the conquest, to readers who find in them a voice that resonates with something they recognize in themselves, the specific human experience of knowing that everything is temporary, that the flowers and the songs will pass, and choosing to make something beautiful anyway. Nezahualcóyotl wrote, or is credited with writing, a poem that goes something like this in rough translation. I understand that even jade will shatter, even gold will break, even Quetzal feathers will lose their luster. We do not live forever on this earth, only for a little while here. Even though it be crystal, it will break. I knew it well, only in your work, only in your song. That is how you leave your mark on the earth. This is not a consolation. It is not an argument that loss does not matter, because everything ends. It is something more austere and more honest than that. An acknowledgement that impermanence is the condition of everything, that the city and its temples and its causeways and its market and its aviaries and its featherwork and its songs would not last forever, that nothing lasts forever, and that the appropriate response to this knowledge is not despair but creation. Make something. Leave your mark. Not because it will endure, because it will not, but because the making is itself the point, the flower and the song that are the deepest human expression of what it means to be alive in a world that ends. Tenochtitlan made something extraordinary. It made one of the greatest cities the world has ever seen, and it made the civilization that produced that city over 2 centuries of sustained effort and ingenuity and political skill and artistic achievement, and yes, cruelty and violence and exploitation, because great civilizations do not come without those either. The city is gone, but the making of it, the record of what it was and how it was built and who lived in it and what they believed and what they created and how they died and how they mourned their dead and how the survivors of its fall kept speaking and making and remembering in the face of everything that tried to silence them. That is not gone. It is recoverable, imperfectly, partially, with effort and humility and willingness to sit with the uncertainty of what cannot be known. It is recoverable, and the recovery is worth the effort, not as an exercise in nostalgia or guilt, but as an act of attention to the full complexity of the human world, which is richer and stranger and more capacious than any single tradition can contain. The night is late, wherever you are. The city outside your window, whatever city it is quieter now than it was hours ago when you began listening. The things that felt urgent earlier in the day have loosened their grip slightly, the way they always do in the hours when the rest of the world has stopped moving and the mind begins to settle towards something like rest. The story of Tenochtitlan, with all its beauty and all its violence and all its irreducible complexity, has moved through you the way a long river moves through a landscape, not erasing what was there before but changing its shape slightly, depositing something in the process of its passing. What you carry from it is yours to determine. Maybe only the image of the market, 60,000 voices in the morning light, the smell of copal and maize and lake water, maybe only the sound of the great drum at the top of the pyramid, its resonance carrying across the water to the shore. Maybe nothing that can be named, only the faint residue of having been in the presence of something enormous and lost, and still, somehow, present. That is enough. Let it settle. Let the mind rest. The water is still there beneath the city. The stones are still there beneath the water. The night continues, and in the morning the sun will rise, as it has done every morning since the first morning, which is itself a kind of miracle that no amount of familiarity has entirely stripped of its strangeness. Sleep well. There is a figure in this story who has not yet received the attention she deserves, partly because the historical record gives her only fragments, and partly because the fragments that exist are filtered through perspectives that did not fully understand what they were observing. Malintzin, the woman the Spanish called Donna Marina and the later Mexican nationalist tradition called La Malinche, was born sometime around 1500 into a noble family in the Coatzacoalcos region, a Gulf Coast area at the borders between Nahuatl-speaking and Maya-speaking territory. When she was a child, her family, or the political circumstances of her family's world, resulted in her being sold into slavery. The specific circumstances are disputed, tangled up in accounts written generations after her death, but what is clear is that by the time the Spanish arrived on the coast, she was the property of a chief in the Tabasco region, and that she was among the 20 women given to the Spanish force as part of the peace settlement after the Battle of Tabasco in March of 1519. She was baptized, given the Christian name Marina, and allocated to one of the Spanish captains. Cortés recognized her linguistic capabilities almost immediately and took her into his own household. What followed was a relationship of extraordinary intimacy and extraordinary power imbalance, the combination of which defies simple characterization. She served as Cortés's primary interpreter, his voice in every conversation with Moctezuma and his representatives, with Cuauhtémoc, with the Tlaxcalans, with every indigenous polity the Spanish encountered. This means she was present at every critical negotiation in the conquest, translating the words of rulers and warriors and priests from Nahuatl into Maya, which was then rendered into Spanish by the priest Jerónimo de Aguilar. She bore Cortés a son, Martin, who is sometimes called the first mestizo in the literature of Mexican identity, though the symbolic weight placed on that title obscures both the circumstances of his birth and the historical reality that mixed ancestry individuals existed in Mesoamerica before the Spanish arrived. She witnessed, translated, and participated in the events that destroyed the civilization of her birth, navigating a position between worlds that had no precedent and no adequate language. Later, Mexican nationalist historiography made her into a symbol of betrayal, the woman who gave the Spanish access to the indigenous world, whose translation work enabled the conquest. The word Malinchismo, derived from her name, became a term for the preference of foreign over indigenous, a term of cultural accusation. This reading ignores the circumstances of her life, the absence of meaningful choice that structured her position from the moment she was sold as a child, and the complexity of loyalty in a world that the conquest was destroying, regardless of what she did or did not do. More recent feminist and indigenous scholarship has worked to recover a more complete picture of her agency within the constraints she operated under, and the picture that emerges is of a woman of extraordinary intelligence and adaptability, who made the best use she could of a position that was not of her choosing. The Tlaxcalans, who provided the indigenous military force without which the conquest could not have succeeded, deserve the same kind of complex consideration that Malincin deserves, and that the nationalist historical tradition, with its clean narrative of indigenous resistance versus Spanish conquest, has difficulty providing. The Tlaxcalan leaders, who made the decision to ally with Cortés in September of 1519, were not naive. They were not deceived. They were making a calculated political decision based on the information available to them, the same kind of calculation that political leaders have always made when confronted with a powerful new force whose ultimate intentions are unclear. Their enemy, Tenochtitlan, had besieged them for generations. The Spanish had demonstrated they could fight and that their weapons were devastating. The alliance offered the possibility of using the Spanish against the Mexica and emerging from the conflict in a stronger position than they had occupied before. That the alliance ultimately resulted in their own subordination to Spanish colonial power. That the freedom from Mexica domination they had hoped to achieve through the alliance was replaced by a different form of domination was not foreseeable from where they stood in September of 1519. You cannot blame people for failing to predict the full consequences of a situation without historical precedent. But the Tlaxcalan alliance complicates the story, and complication is uncomfortable for national mythology, which prefers its heroes unambiguous and its villains clear. The warriors of Tenochtitlan, who fought the siege, deserve their own space in this account. The Mexica warrior tradition was one of the most highly developed in the pre-Columbian Americas, with a system of ranks and honors earned through the capture of enemies in battle, a specialized military elite whose training began in childhood, and a cultural framework that understood the warrior's role in cosmic terms, as the maintainers of the relationship between the human and the sun, the people whose courage and blood kept the world going. The Eagle Warriors and the Jaguar Warriors, the two elite military orders whose regalia gave them their names, were the most highly honored soldiers in the Mexica system, and their performance in the siege of Tenochtitlan was remarkable by any military standard. They were fighting in familiar territory, with the organizational depth of a city behind them, against an enemy with steel weapons and horses and firearms. They developed tactics to counter each Spanish advantage. They learned to avoid the horses, attacking from the flanks and from above. They deployed obsidian-bladed weapons long enough to reach past the horses' legs. They used the narrow streets and canals to neutralize the impact of cavalry charges. They dug traps and built barricades and organized the civilian population to participate in the defense. They captured prisoners and demonstrated to the watching Spanish force that the Spanish were not invulnerable, not gods, not beyond reach. They fought until there was literally nowhere left to fight, until the city was rubble and the food was gone and the water was fouled and the living were crowded into the last corner of what had once been the greatest city in the hemisphere. They fought until Cuauhtémoc was taken, and then they stopped because there was nothing left to fight for and nowhere left to stand. The women of Tenochtitlan during the siege are less visible in the accounts, because the accounts were written by men whose cultural frame did not find women's actions in war worth detailed recording unless they were exceptional enough to be impossible to ignore, but they were present throughout. The accounts mention women throwing stones from rooftops onto the advancing soldiers. They mention women carrying supplies to the defenders. They mention the women who died when the buildings they had sheltered in collapsed under bombardment. They mention, in the accounts of the aftermath, the women who were enslaved by the Spanish soldiers after the fall, who were branded on the face with a hot iron and assigned to the households of the conquistadors, who disappeared into the colonial system as servants and concubines and mothers of mixed ancestry children, some of whose descendants are walking the streets of Mexico City today. The silence around these women in the historical record is itself a form of erasure, and the recovery of their stories, which is possible only in fragments, is part of the ongoing work of understanding the full human dimensions of what happened. The children of Tenochtitlan during the siege were the most fully silenced of all, because children in historical records are almost always voiceless, their experience reconstructed from adult accounts that describe them at a distance or not at all. What is known is that children were inside the city throughout the siege, that they shared the conditions of the trapped population, that they died of thirst and starvation and disease alongside the adults, and that the survivors of the siege who were children would carry those memories into adult lives lived under Spanish colonial rule. Some of those children were orphaned by the siege, their parents killed in the fighting or dead of disease. The colonial church provided for some of these orphans, creating schools that were among the earliest educational institutions of New Spain, and some of the most important indigenous scholars of the colonial period, the Nahuatl speakers who worked with Sahagún and with other missionaries to document the Old World, may have been among these orphaned children of the siege generation. The priests of Tenochtitlan during the fall are described in the Spanish accounts as among the most committed defenders, the most resistant to the pressures the Spanish applied to abandon the old religious practices. The missionaries who came after the conquest and the friars who established the earliest churches in Mexico City wrote about the difficulty of converting the indigenous population, about the persistence of the old practices, about the idols that were hidden inside or behind the images of saints, about the ceremonies that continued in modified form under the cover of Christian festivals. This resistance was not simply stubbornness or ignorance. The priests who maintained the old practices understood, with a clarity that the missionaries found exasperating, that the Spanish were not offering an alternative, they were offering replacement. The difference matters. An alternative can be adopted while something of the old is preserved. A replacement demands the abandonment of everything that preceded it. The priests of Tenochtitlan, many of whom had dedicated their lives to the maintenance of the ritual knowledge and the ceremonial traditions that held the world together in the Mexica understanding, were being asked to acknowledge that everything they knew was wrong, everything they had done was evil, and everything they had been was something that needed to be erased. Some of them complied, publicly. Many of them continued in private, teaching what they could teach in the conditions available, preserving what could be preserved in the memories of children who would carry it forward in fragmentary form into a world that did not officially recognize its existence. The question of human sacrifice in the Mexica tradition is one that cannot be avoided in any honest account of the civilization, and it is also one that has been so consistently used to delegitimize that civilization, to argue that what happened to it was not tragedy, but justice. that addressing it requires care. The evidence for large-scale human sacrifice in the Mexica tradition is unambiguous. It is documented in the archaeological record, in the offering caches of the Templo Maya that contain the remains of sacrificed individuals, in the skull rack, the Tzompantli, where the skulls of the sacrificed were displayed. Recent excavations, of which in 2015 revealed a structure of extraordinary scale, its full extent still being established. It is documented in the indigenous sources compiled by Sahagún and others, which describe the ceremonies and the scale of the sacrifice in detail. It is documented in the Spanish eyewitness accounts. The sacrifice happened. It was not an exaggeration of the Spanish. What requires more careful consideration is the meaning of the sacrifice and the context in which it occurred, and what the appropriate place of the sacrifice is in an overall assessment of the civilization. The sacrifice was embedded in a theological framework in which the death of the individual on the sacrificial stone was understood as a sacred act, a form of the highest honor, not a punishment, but a fulfillment. The individuals sacrificed were primarily captive warriors, whose capture in battle was the honorable outcome of the Flower Wars, and who were understood to be completing a destiny initiated in their capture. They were not, in the Mexica understanding, being murdered. They were being given to the sun. This understanding does not eliminate the violence or the suffering, and it does not make the institution morally equivalent to an institution in which no lives are taken. But it does mean that reducing the sacrifice to sadism or barbarism misses the cosmological logic that produced it, a logic in which human life was understood as part of a larger cosmic economy of energy and obligation, in which nothing was free, in which the maintenance of the world required cost. The scale of the sacrifice in the later imperial period is historically significant. The dedication of the new Templo Maya under Ahuizotl in 1487 was accompanied, according to indigenous sources compiled decades later, by a sacrifice of thousands of captives over 4 days. The number given in the sources, sometimes as high as 20,000, is almost certainly exaggerated in the manner of ceremonial numbers that were meant to convey cosmic significance rather than precise enumeration. But even a fraction of that number represents a scale of sacrifice that troubled even some of the Mexica's allies and clients, and that the historical record suggests provoked genuine revulsion and fear in the communities that were subject to Mexica tribute demands. The sacrifice was a political instrument as much as a religious one, a demonstration of power and a mechanism of terror that helped maintain the empire's hold over its subject peoples. Understanding it in this way does not require approving of it. It does require acknowledging that the same institution that was understood internally as the maintenance of cosmic order was understood externally as a mechanism of domination, and that both readings have evidence to support them. The Spanish invoked the sacrifice as the primary justification for the conquest, the proof that the Mexica were a people who needed to be saved from themselves, whose civilization was so fundamentally corrupt that its destruction was an act of mercy. This argument served the purposes of the conquest, and the purposes of the papacy, and the purposes of the Spanish crown, in ways that made it politically essential regardless of its moral accuracy. Whether the Spanish conquests of the Americas were religiously or morally justified was debated even at the time, by scholars and theologians who were troubled by what they were hearing from the New World. The great Dominican friar, Bartolomé de las Casas, who spent decades in the Caribbean and Mexico and Central America and wrote the most devastating contemporary critique of the conduct of the Spanish conquest, the very brief account of the destruction of the Indies, argued that the indigenous peoples of the Americas had the same human dignity and the same rights as any other people, that their different religious practices did not make them less than human or make their destruction acceptable, that what the Spanish were doing was not liberation but atrocity. Las Casas was a minority voice in his own time. He was heard enough to provoke the new laws of 1542, which attempted to regulate the treatment of indigenous people in the colonies. But the laws were largely unenforceable in the colonial context, and their implementation was resisted by the colonists, who depended on indigenous labor. The debate Las Casas opened has never been fully closed. It is still being conducted, in different vocabulary, in the political and cultural conversations about the meaning of the conquest that continue to this day. The 500th anniversary of the fall of Tenochtitlan was marked in 2021 with a complicated set of official and unofficial commemorations in Mexico, reflecting the complicated relationship that contemporary Mexican society has with this history. The Mexican government, under President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, sent a letter to the Spanish King Felipe VI requesting an apology for the conquest. The Spanish government declined, responding that the conquest could not be judged by the moral standards of the present, which is itself a position that contains more complexity than its brevity suggests. The indigenous communities of Mexico organized their own commemorations, which were less concerned with apologies from Spain than with the acknowledgement of the ongoing consequences of the conquest in their own lives, in the land tenure systems, and the political structures and the economic conditions that continue to reflect the colonial inheritance. The commemorations in Mexico City included protests and demonstrations, the toppling of a statue of Christopher Columbus from its pedestal on the main boulevard, the Paseo de la Reforma, and its replacement, temporarily, with a statue of an indigenous woman that was itself controversial in its representation. The 500th anniversary produced no resolution because the questions it raised do not have resolutions, only ongoing conversations. The metro system of Mexico City, which is one of the most heavily used urban transit systems in the world, carries its passengers through the layers of the city's history in a way that is not purely metaphorical. Several of the metro stations are built over or beside archaeological sites, and in some stations, the ruins are visible through glass panels in the floor or displayed in adjacent museum spaces. The Pino Suarez station contains a small Aztec temple, found during construction, preserved inside the station structure. The Zocalo station contains a section of the old colonial aqueduct. The Tlatelolco station, near the site of the old market, is adjacent to the Plaza de las Tres Culturas, the Plaza of the Three Cultures, where the ruins of the pre-Columbian Tlatelolco, the colonial church of Santiago Tlatelolco, and the modernist residential towers of the Nonoalco Tlatelolco housing project stand in the same space. Three periods of the city's history simultaneously visible. The plaza is also the site of one of the most painful events of modern Mexican history, the massacre of student protesters by government security forces in October 1968, 10 days before the Mexico City Olympics, an event that adds a fourth layer of historical violence to a space already defined by its accumulation of endings. The geology of the Valley of Mexico is itself a form of historical record. The volcanic rock that the Mexica quarried for their building projects still outcrops in the southern parts of the city, in the Pedregal area, and in Xochimilco, where the ancient lava flows created the irregular terrain that was too rough for extensive chinampa farming, but that provided stone for construction. The basalt blocks of the Templo Mayor were quarried from these outcrops, transported by canoe across the lake, shaped by craftsmen with only stone tools. Because the Mexica, like all pre-Columbian peoples of the Americas, had no iron. Everything they built in stone was built with tools of obsidian and flint and harder stone, and the precision of the stonework, visible in the surviving sections of the temple foundation, was achieved not with steel chisels, but with patient work and accumulated craft knowledge. The volcanoes Popocatépetl and Iztaccíhuatl are still visible from the city on clear days, which are fewer now than they used to be because of the air quality created by 22 million people and their vehicles and their factories in a mountain basin with limited air circulation. Popocatépetl is still active. It has erupted multiple times in recent decades, sending plumes of ash and gas above the valley, and the civil emergency plans for a major eruption, which would require the evacuation of hundreds of thousands of people from the communities on its slopes, are maintained and periodically reviewed. The mountain that the Mexica named Popocatépetl, the smoking mountain, is still smoking. The name they gave it is still its name. Some things persist. The water that ran through the aqueducts of Tenochtitlan came from springs in the hill of Chapultepec, which means Hill of the Grasshopper in Nahuatl, a name still used for the park that occupies a portion of the original royal forest and retreat that once extended across those hills. Chapultepec Park is now one of the largest urban parks in the world, home to the National Museum of Anthropology, the National History Museum, a zoo, several lakes, and the castle that served as the official residence of the Mexican president until the early 20th century. On weekends, it fills with Mexico City families, grandparents and children and teenagers and couples, vendors of corn and snow cones and balloons, cyclists and joggers, and people sitting on the grass, looking at the lake where ducks move in their purposeful circles. If you sit very still in the right part of the park and close your eyes and let the ambient noise soften, you can sometimes reach a register of attention where what you are sitting inside is not the 21st century, but something older, the cool shade of a forest that has been a forest for longer than the city around it, the presence of stone and water, and the particular quality of high-altitude light that has been the same since before any city existed in the valley. The springs at Chapultepec that fed the aqueducts of Tenochtitlan are still flowing, though at much reduced volume than they once did. The aquifer that feeds them, drawn down by the demands of the city above. The water that comes out of them now is monitored and managed as part of the city's water supply infrastructure, cleaned and treated before it enters the distribution system, but it is the same water that rose from the same aquifer and travelled through the same hills that the Mexica engineers found and channeled across the lake 5 centuries ago. There is a continuity there that the city's surface does not reveal. The same water, still moving, still present, still the foundation of urban life in the valley. Only the system that moves it has changed, from stone aqueducts to underground pipes. The Museum of Anthropology, which houses the most important collection of pre-Columbian Mexican artifacts in the world, was designed by the architect Pedro Ramirez Vázquez and opened in 1964, and it is itself one of the great architectural achievements of 20th century Mexico. The building is organized around a central courtyard covered by a vast flat roof, supported by a single central pillar, from which water cascades continuously in a kind of permanent artificial rain, and the galleries open off this central space in a sequence that moves from the archaeological cultures that preceded the Aztec to the Aztec Room itself, which is the largest and most visited gallery in the building, and then to the ethnographic galleries on the upper floor, where the living descendants of the pre-Columbian cultures are represented in their contemporary forms. The sequence is intentional. You move from the ancient past to the complex present, from the artifact to the living community, in a building that insists that these are not separate things, that the people represented in the ethnographic galleries upstairs are the continuation of the people represented in the archaeological galleries below, that the history is not over, that the civilization did not simply end in 1521. The Aztec Room of the Museum of Anthropology is the room where the Aztec sunstone lives, mounted on the wall rather than on the floor as it would originally have been oriented, because upright display makes it more legible to museum visitors. Standing in front of it, at the scale of a human being confronting a disc of carved basalt 12 feet across, weighing 24 tons, is an experience of physical diminishment that is itself informative. The people who made this object made it at a scale that dwarfs the individual human being, that demands a different kind of looking than the museum case with the small ceramic vessel requires. You step back to take it all in, and in stepping back you acknowledge the proportional relationship the object insists on. The human being small, the cosmic system large, the symbols arranged in their concentric circles, speaking a language that takes years to learn, and that once known reveals a view of time and structure and obligation that is coherent, complete, and entirely unlike anything that developed independently in the European tradition from which the museum itself was derived. The museum borrowed from the European encyclopedic tradition the idea of gathering objects from across a civilization in a single building for systematic display and study. But the objects it gathers resist the domestication that museum display tends to impose. They insist on their original context, their original scale of meaning, their refusal to be simply decorative or simply archaeological. The ongoing excavations at the Templo Mayor site have in the past several years been producing results of particular significance, including the discovery in 2021 of a large wooden platform associated with the Tzompantli, the skull rack, that appears to have supported a tower of skulls, estimated to have contained several hundred skulls, cemented together in a circular structure of a kind not previously documented at the site. The discovery was reported in the popular press in terms that emphasized the macabre spectacle, as such discoveries tend to be, with less attention to what the archaeological context reveals about the organization and purpose of the structure and its place in the ceremonial life of the sacred precinct. The skulls belong to both men and women and children, which the initial reporting found shocking, though the sacrifice of children, associated particularly with the rain god ceremonies, is well documented in the Mexica sources, and not unexpected in a ceremonial deposit of this kind. The archaeological study of the structure, which is ongoing, is producing information about the specific individuals whose skulls were incorporated into it through isotopic analysis of the bone material and other forensic techniques, providing a picture of where these individuals came from geographically, what they ate, what their health status was, what their age and sex distribution was. This information, accumulated slowly and carefully through scientific analysis, adds to the picture of the scale and organization of Mexica ceremonial practice in ways that go beyond what any written source can provide. The city of Tlaxcala, which allied with the Spanish, and whose warriors were the largest component of the force that besieged and took Tenochtitlan, has a complicated place in the national mythology of Mexico. The Mexican national narrative, which was organized in the 19th century around an ideology that celebrated the indigenous heritage of the country, while identifying the Spanish conquest as the central trauma of Mexican history, had difficulty accommodating the Tlaxcalans, who were both indigenous and collaborators with the Spanish. The solution adopted by the national mythology was largely to minimize the Tlaxcalan role, to present the conquest as primarily a confrontation between the Spanish and the Mexica, and to treat the Tlaxcalan alliance as a secondary element that does not disturb the clean narrative of indigenous resistance and Spanish invasion. This treatment has been criticized by historians and by the Tlaxcalans themselves, who point out that their role in the conquest was decisive and that their motivations were coherent given the political context they faced. The state of Tlaxcala was given special privileges by the Spanish crown in recognition of its alliance, privileges that persisted into the colonial period, and that some argue gave the Tlaxcalan population slightly better conditions than other indigenous groups in the immediate colonial period. Whether this constitutes a vindication of their decision is a question that does not have a clean answer. The corn that grows in the milpa, the traditional mixed crop planting system of central Mexico that combines maize, beans, and squash in a single field to complement each other's nutritional and agricultural properties, was domesticated from its wild ancestor, Teosinte, over a period of thousands of years in what is now Mexico, the result of sustained, deliberate cultivation selection by generations of farmers who were doing something that later science would recognize as plant breeding without having any of the conceptual vocabulary of modern genetics. The maize that feeds half the world today is the product of that work, of the observation and selection and patient cultivation of farmers who noticed which plants produced more, which were more resistant to drought, which produced the properties of the kernel that made it useful in different preparations. This is a form of intellectual achievement that is rarely recognized as such in the way that the intellectual achievements of literate cultures are recognized, because it did not produce written records, and because it was accomplished through embodied knowledge and practice rather than through the formalized knowledge systems that leave textual traces. But the achievement is real, and its consequences are global. The corn and the tomato and the potato and the cacao and the vanilla and the avocado and the chili and the rubber and the tobacco and the many other domesticated plants that originated in the Americas and are now part of the global agricultural and culinary system. These are the most lasting contribution of the civilizations that produced them to the world, a contribution more durable than any pyramid or any codex, because the plants themselves carry the accumulated knowledge of their domestication in their genetic structure. The chocolate that you may have had today, if you had any, is the descendant of the cacao that was consumed as a bitter ceremonial drink in the courts of Tenochtitlan and Texcoco and Tlaxcala, mixed with water and ground spices, and sometimes honey, frothed by pouring from one vessel held high to another vessel held low, the froth considered the finest part of the drink. The word chocolate itself comes from the Nahuatl xocolatl, bitter water, or possibly from a Yucatec Maya compound. Scholars have not fully resolved the etymology. The cacao beans that produced it were valuable enough to serve as currency in the Mexica market system. They came to Tenochtitlan as tribute from the lowland regions where the cacao tree grew, carried in loads of hundreds and thousands of beans by the tribute payers and by the long-distance merchants of the Pocteca network. When the Spanish brought cacao back to Europe in the 16th century, and it made its way into the courts of the European nobility, sweetened with sugar and served hot as a luxury beverage, the drink was still recognizable in its basic form as what the Mexica had drunk, modified in its sweetness and its preparation, but made from the same bean, cultivated through the same tradition of agricultural knowledge that the American civilizations had developed. The transformation of xocolatl into chocolate, from a bitter ceremonial drink in the palaces of Tenochtitlan to a sweet luxury in the courts of Madrid and Versailles, to the thing that comes in a wrapper from the supermarket today. That is a 500-year journey that started in the agricultural valleys of pre-Columbian Mexico and has not ended. There is a word in Nahuatl, Nepantla, that means something like in the middle or in between, at the crossing point between two states or worlds. It was used by indigenous people in the colonial period to describe their own condition, their existence between the world that had been destroyed and the world that was being imposed, their occupancy of a space that was neither the old nor the new, but something that had no name yet. The writer and scholar Gloria Anzaldúa adopted the term in the late 20th century and made it central to her theoretical framework for understanding the experience of people who live on the borderlands between cultures, between languages, between identities, who are always in between, and for whom the in-between is not a temporary condition to be resolved, but a permanent location that has its own validity, its own epistemology, its own ways of knowing that neither of the cultures on either side fully possesses. Nepantla, in this expanded sense, describes the condition of much of Mexico, a country that has been living between the pre-Columbian and the European, between the indigenous and the colonial, between what was and what is, for 500 years. It describes the condition of the millions of people of Mexican descent living in the United States, between Mexican and American identities that are both real and neither complete. It describes, perhaps, the condition of anyone who takes seriously the complexity of the human past, who refuses the simplifications that nationalist mythology offers, who insists on sitting with the discomfort of not knowing where to put their loyalty in a story that does not arrange itself into clean heroes and villains. The ruins of Tenochtitlan, what remains of them above ground, are in the heart of the most populous city in the Americas. You can visit them on a Tuesday afternoon in the middle of the city's ordinary working week, walking from the Zocalo down a side street past shops selling phone accessories and tacos and lottery tickets, and arrive at a chain-link fence beyond which the grey stones of the Templo Mayor's foundations are exposed in their layers. The successive construction phases, visible as rings of stone at different levels, the oldest at the bottom and the most recent at the top, each one built around and over the previous one in the Mexica practice of periodic renewal. Hummingbirds visit the flowers planted in the excavation area. The noise of the city, buses and horns and voices, and the percussion of construction happening somewhere nearby flows continuously over the fence and over the stones and over the spaces between them, where the offerings were placed and where the archaeologists work with their brushes and their trowels and their camera equipment. The past and the present are in the same air, breathing the same particulate matter, existing simultaneously in the same square meters of the Earth's surface. This is not a metaphor. It is the literal condition of the place. And it is, In a certain light, one of the most remarkable things about the story of Tenochtitlan, not that it was built and not that it fell, but that it is still here, in the form that history always takes, which is not preservation but persistence, not the survival of the thing itself, but the survival of its traces in the matter and the memory of the world that came after it. The stones are here, the language is here, the corn is here, the chocolate is here, the marigolds that go on the Day of the Dead altars are here, the same species, the cempasúchil, the flower of the dead, that grew in the gardens of Tenochtitlan and was used in the flower festivals of the Mexica ritual calendar. The songs are here, or the fragments of them, in the manuscripts that Sahagun and his informants compiled and that have been edited and translated and studied by generations of scholars and that are now digitized and available online to anyone who wants to read them, in Spanish or in English or in the original Nahuatl, if you have the training to do so. The stories are here. The myths of Quetzalcoatl and Huitzilopochtli and Coyolxauhqui and Tlaloc, told now in museum galleries and university classrooms and children's books and the tourist placards in the Templo Maya archaeological zone, imperfectly transmitted, inevitably simplified, but present, recognizable, carrying still some residue of the cosmological weight they were designed to carry. The mountains are here. Popocatépetl and Iztaccíhuatl, the smoking mountain and the white woman, visible from the city on the days when the air is clear enough to see that far, which are more frequent in recent years than they were in the worst decades of the city's air pollution crisis, a small sign that some things can be improved, that the relationship between a city and its natural context is not fixed and one-directional, but responsive, capable of change in both directions. The volcanoes were visible from the causeways of Tenochtitlan, framed at the end of the long, straight road that led to the city from the east. The direction from which the sun rose and from which the Spanish came, the direction that Quetzalcoatl was supposed to return from. Cortés came from the east. The coincidence is either cosmic or meaningless, depending on what you believe about the relationship between symbolic order and historical event. Moctezuma, who thought in symbolic terms, who understood the world through its signs and its patterns, may have found the coincidence significant. Cortés, who thought in practical terms, who understood the world through its material leverage points, would have found the question irrelevant. Their inability to fully understand each other, to find a common framework within which the situation could be interpreted and managed, was perhaps the deepest problem of the encounter, more fundamental even than the military imbalance, more consequential even than the epidemic disease. Two different ways of reading the world, meeting on a causeway over a lake, and neither one fully comprehending what it was looking at. What you are left with, after a long journey through this story, is not resolution, but the specific kind of unresolved feeling that real history produces when you take it seriously, the feeling of having touched something enormous and only partially understood it, of having come close enough to see the shape of the thing without being able to take in the whole of it. The fall of Tenochtitlan is not a story that has a moral, in the sense of a clean lesson that can be extracted from the narrative and applied. It is a story that has weight, the weight of all the lives that lived inside it, and the lives that were ended by it, and the lives that came after it, and are still coming after it, still shaped by the consequences of what happened in a lake in central Mexico 500 years ago. The weight is real, the story matters, and the fact that you are here, in the small hours, letting it move through you, is itself a form of the attention that the dead deserve from the living, the act of remembrance that holds open the space between forgetting and knowing, the place where the past persists, not as a fixed and finished thing, but as a living presence in the consciousness of those who choose to carry it. The night outside, wherever you are, is the same night that falls over Mexico City, the same dark that covers the Templo Maya and the Metropolitan Cathedral and the Zocalo and the Chapultepec Springs and the last Chinampa Gardens of Xochimilco and the smoking summit of Popocatépetl and the whole vast urban landscape, built on the bones of a lake that was once the center of a civilization that understood the world as a relationship requiring maintenance. The same stars that the Mexica astronomers tracked, the Pleiades and Venus, and the slow procession of the constellations across the sky are above you now, in the spaces between the clouds and the light pollution, present whether you can see them or not. The world continues. The sun will rise in the morning, as it has risen every morning since the first morning, tended in the Mexica, understanding by the offerings and the ceremonies and the attentiveness of a people who took seriously their responsibility to the continuation of what exists. We no longer understand ourselves as responsible for the rising of the sun. We have other things to be responsible for, and some of them are urgent. But the underlying intuition that we are part of something larger than ourselves, that what we do and what we attend to and what we choose to remember has consequences that extend beyond our individual lifetimes, is not wrong. It is one of the things the story of Tenochtitlan leaves behind, a residue of seriousness about the relationship between human consciousness and the world it inhabits, a reminder that the greatest civilizations are not necessarily the ones that lasted the longest, but the ones that, while they lasted, understood what they were doing and why, and made something worth remembering from the time they had. Sleep now. The story has been told. The night is long and it is yours. Let the images settle. The market, the causeways, the mountain above the lake, the eagle on the cactus, the drum that could be heard for miles, the flowers and the songs that were there at the beginning and were there at the end, the water still running beneath the city. Let them be there, quiet and present, while you drift toward the rest that the body needs and the mind allows. The morning will come. It always does. The valley holds its quiet now. The volcanoes stand as they have always stood, patient beyond any human patience, carrying in their stone cores the geological memory of eruptions that preceded the Mexica by millions of years and that will follow whatever comes next by millions more. The city sleeps around its ruins. The archaeologists will return tomorrow with their brushes and their instruments to the stones in the ground, recovering another small piece of what was there, adding it carefully to the picture that grows year by year. The language continues to be spoken by the people who kept it alive through everything. The corn continues to grow. The morning continues to come.